crime directives?
Serve the public trust. Protect the innocent.
Thank you!
Uphold the law.
It's dangerous!
It was considered to be just another low-budget science fiction movie with a silly title.
Perhaps you're aware of the RoboCop program developed by myself at Security Concepts.
RoboCop is a little bit like the guy who rides into a corrupt town and cleans it up.
Your move, creep.
And to me, this was very clearly a metaphor of the knight in shining armor.
Let the woman go. You are under arrest.
It's just such incredibly good filmmaking. It's as tight as a nest of Chinese boxes. I mean, you can just keep opening these lids and finding different things inside, but each one of those boxes is perfectly handcrafted. That film is very, very well put together.
Although the movie is set in the future, like any movie, it's a product of its time. And this is really a product of the Reagan era.
I say good business is where you find it.
I like violence, you know. I like violence in movies. I wanted to show Satan killing Jesus.
Cinematic robots have a long and illustrious history. Some of the earliest films, in fact, either had mechanical people or artificial humans.
There is positively no human agency employed whatsoever in controlling it.
Something what people are dreaming of, nah? Being a person, mankind being a machine. Nah?
Musicians of the world unite. Automation is on the way.
I think there are two films that were important to me when I shot RoboCop, which was The Day the Earth Stood Still, and the other one was Fritz Lang's movie Metropolis. And you can see a lot of parallels, especially with the robot that Lang invented.
Even as early as 1922, Lang sort of foretold and forecast the Western culture's ambivalence about technology. Maria is this beautiful, shining, durable construct that at the same time is manipulative and violent and sexual and all the darker elements of what started to creep into technology and man's awareness of technology.
Ours is a male version of Fritz Lang. We have a little bit more sophisticated outlook, a bit more high-tech, but it's still very close.
RoboCop, who is he? What is he? Where does he come from?
RoboCop was an idea that I came up with when I was an executive at Universal Pictures, and I couldn't stand my job, so I went off and wrote a screenplay. Michael Miner came through the door and said, "Oh, you want to write a script about a robot? I like robots." And there we were. The first idea for RoboCop was a robot. And then it very quickly it became a man who became a robot.
Ed and I were thinking of two ideas independently. He had an idea called RoboCop, which was about a robot police officer.
What is this shit?
And I was playing with an idea called Super Cop about a character who has an accident and then is hooked up to an appliance that enhances his powers. We were writing RoboCop when Terminator was being finished, and we waited until the script was finished before we saw the film. I guess they could both be called postmodern robot films in the sense that the humor is very dark. I think that the Cameron film is much more a horror film than RoboCop, which to me is social satire with some very real emotions in it.
They brought it to Jonathan Kaplan, and Jonathan Kaplan didn't want to do it. So he suggested that they bring it to me. Orion had produced The Terminator, and I'm sure the success of that film led them to take a chance.
We went over to Orion, and they just said, "Okay, let's go." And it was like, whoa, we sold a script. We're writing it.
We basically went right through the list of every halfway decent American director, and every one of them turned it down. And I have a feeling most of them probably never got past the title page that said RoboCop. They could just envision it on their resume, you know, and thinking, no, I don't want to go there. Everybody had reservations about the title because the title is just basically silly. And no matter who you told the title to, you could just see it, the expression on their face like, God, why are they involved with such a piece of junk, you know? So we often thought about trying to come up with a better title, but it stuck.
In fact, I remember Orion saying, we can never sell it with that title. It's stupid. It sounds like a kid's movie. But in the end, a title that tells you what the movie is really quite good.
Action! Go!
I'd always been this huge fan of Paul Verhoeven. Barbara Boyle had just finished doing Flesh and Blood with him for Orion. She said, well, let me send it to Paul Verhoeven. Paul was having trouble in Holland. He just was not getting along with the people in the film business there, I guess.
First movies that I did, included Soldier of Orange, were always financed by government that was right wing. Now, when the government changed to the left wing, I started to have problems. It started already with spatters, because they thought it was decadent and perverted.
Paul's the director. He can direct actors. Beautiful camera work. I mean, Kichi Tipple, Soldier of Orange, Spetters, Turkish Delight. I mean, these are good pictures. I can't imagine in a million years that Paul Verhoeven would want to do this picture. And sure enough, he said no.
When I got finally that script of RoboCop and I read it, I thought it was extremely silly and stupid. I threw it on the floor and saying, I'm not going to shoot this kind of rubbish. My wife picked up that script, RoboCop, and read it. And she said, you know, yeah, this is perhaps not, it's not Shakespeare, but it is a script with more layers than you think.
Martine read it and said, there's decapitations and people getting their arms ripped off. You'll like it. And indeed, he said, well, I have never seen the hero get his hand blown off.
And he sent us a telegram saying that he would do the picture. And no one was more shocked than I.
In the movies like Turkish Delight or Soldier of Orange, The Forced Man and Spetters, which are the most well-known in the United States, you are really talking about people and no, not special effects. So it's strange because I had never done anything like that. And it was not that I was craving to do it. It was not that I thought, my God, I remember these movies out of my youth and I want to do them myself. I think that in general I would say that I was not a big fan of science fiction.
Doesn't matter, we're going to blank his memory anyway.
I think it's really amazing if you look at Paul's work. There's nothing that indicates anything like this before, and he effortlessly pulls that off.
Well, he signed the release forms when he joined the force. He's legally dead. We can do pretty much what we want to.
This cynical, very unblinking look at violence was something that Paul could do.
Ooh, guns.
A good director can adopt to any kind of genre, to any genre. That's the key. If the guy's got talent, he can do anything, you know, and Paul can do anything.
I often say that he is a visceralist, not a visualist. Kubrick's a visualist. He is very cold and concise, and he wants you to see it and study it. And Paul wants you to be reacting like, shit, the next one might hit me.
As I started to work with the writers, I picked up so many layers and additional elements, and I got really inspired by what was already on the paper, by extending that, emphasizing it, pushing it. And so that ultimately it might be my best American movie.
Foreign directors critique America better than Americans can, because they're on the outside and they approach it anthropologically. And that's another thing that I think Paul brought to the material.
I really have a lot of respect for Paul. He's the real deal. He's like a real director. You know, he's totally focused.
It was really me thinking, okay, science fiction is not my genre, but I think I understand something of the soul of RoboCop. And there is something artistic about the whole project. And something humanitarian, if you want to.
Murphy, transferring in from Metro South.
We had been looking for an actor that could do a RoboCop for a very long time. And we didn't make any progress. For a moment, we thought that we would take Michael Ironside.
We saw Michael Ironside and liked him a lot, but he was a little too big, we thought, to fit the costume.
It was a given from the beginning that they would have to find a certain body type because they were literally going to construct the robo-suit around the actor. So you didn't want someone who was too large because you would have all kinds of problems about, you know, fitting the person into it and also being able to move.
After 3-4 months of searching, we still hadn't found anybody. And then ultimately somebody called us and said, well, Peter Weller is in New York and why don't you visit him? He might be interested.
Peter Weller made a bit of a splash on a film called Buckaroo Banzai, Across the Eighth Dimension. And John Davison certainly was aware of Peter's work in Buckaroo Banzai, so he was one of the people who tested for it.
I pointed out that it would be a life of suffering and that he would not be happy.
Peter had martial arts training, so that was appealing. We knew that a lot of his performance would be mime, so we needed somebody who liked the idea of doing mime.
He started immediately to take lessons about choreographing his steps, basically how he would have to walk with a RoboCop costume on.
Peter very much had in mind these kind of quick bird-like movements, particularly when he is fighting.
Originally, we had cast Stephanie Zimbalist in the role of Lewis. And a couple of weeks before we started shooting, she pulled out. So we were in a mad scramble to find someone to replace her. And fortunately, we found Nancy Allen, who was available.
I haven't really had a chance to introduce myself. I'm Ann Lewis.
Nancy Allen, primarily before that, had been playing kind of shallow, bitchy teenage characters. Carrie, of course, is her signature part. But she was also always known for having these long strawberry curls. Very first thing Paul said to her is, "Cut your hair."
I'm a mess.
Paul was actually trying, once again, to take a performer with an established persona and tweak it.
You really don't remember me, do you?
Dick Jones, the character who Ronny Cox plays, is one of the most evil, manipulative, and corrupt of the OCP officials.
You just fucked with the wrong guy.
But prior to playing Dick Jones, Ronny Cox, for the most part, had played the exact opposite type of character. Wholesome family man or country guitar strumming, ordinary guys. Just very, very nice characters.
I'm confident that we can go to prototype within 90 days.
Rob Bottin, who created the suit, works by sculpting everything in clay three-dimensionally. He started doing a number of full-size sculptures of RoboCop, very little 2D art. We would go over, we being Ed Neumeier, the writer, and Paul Verhoeven and myself would go over to Rob's shop and watch this thing progress. I mean, for a while he looked like Judge Dredd. For a while he looked like, a real superhero with a huge chest and shoulders. But we always went back to sleek, like a product of Detroit in a way.
If Braun the German company had made a knight in shining armor, that's what he would look like.
Ed had found these Japanese comic books where they make this kind of bulky robots with big shoulders, but then in steel. Rob's costume in the beginning was much more like a kind of a bit modernistic version of Fritz Lang. But we thought, we are going to do something better. This Japanese comic books will help us to make it really revolutionary instead of being influenced by the past, and we fucked it up completely. That was a big explosion, artistic explosion between our group nearly and Rob Bottin, who ultimately said, I cannot work this way. Then I think we stepped backwards finally, but when we had lost already months by fooling around. By the time we stepped backwards, he had lost 40–50% of what was good, so it was terrible. Rob Bottin was extremely frustrated, and he couldn't even talk to us anymore, certainly not to me, who he saw as the main guilty person.
Rob figured out that the way to do this would be to create an undersuit that would be flexible, and then to create a harness that fit over the undersuit where you could hang solid pieces of the fiberglass exoskeleton.
Sometimes we were really rubbing it with oil or wax or something that it really got shiny, and I always put a lot of different lights from different directions so that the appearance of the RoboCop was like a figure of reflections. You could always see it outlined in light. It has a power. I always got the camera very low, on very low angles, and the lower the camera is, the more the camera looks up to him, the bigger RoboCop appears.
Well, we shot the movie in Dallas. We did go scout Detroit with Paul, although it did fairly well in the sort of seedy urban department. It didn't have any kind of futuristic skyline or any kind of modern look to it at all.
RoboCop was shot in Dallas from August through October of 1986, which is like the most humid and the hottest, steamiest, nastiest time to be in that part of the world. The temperature on the days that they were shooting there was about 120 to 130 degrees inside. Peter was literally losing pounds of weight every day out of water dehydration. He was constantly having to be hydrated.
Peter had a mime coach by the name of Moni Yakim, and he wanted to work with Moni on practicing basic robotic moves and to create a character through movement. Peter and Moni rehearsed for many, many weeks before the start of filming. Rob Bottin was supposed to deliver the suit about 2 or 3 weeks before principal photography, but as these things go, the suit arrived on the day we needed it to be shot.
Rob was very much delayed because of our problems, isn't it, that we had created partially ourselves, and that's why the costume came so late to the set.
And it took Peter 11 hours to get into the suit the first time because everything needed to be fitted and adjusted and changed and shaved. So by the time Peter walked out of the trailer door 11 hours later, he was in a complete state because everything he had rehearsed with Moni didn't work in this suit.
We had a terrible time and we had to stop production because we got into a conflict, but the conflict was basically because he said I can't do it and I don't know how to walk, and basically and we said and the production said, well, I have to shoot, you know, no time. And he said, well, but I didn't get time to practice. And we said, well, that's a pity. We have to shoot anyhow. It was so devastating. It was so frustrating, and we were so insensitive that we didn't understand that that could not be done. It was only later that I realized that we had done something completely inappropriate, and that Peter Weller had all the right of the world to protest. And so ultimately Mike Medavoy said, okay, let's stop a couple of days and you work with Peter. So we started then to work with the system, with the costume, and we had the video camera, we showed it to him, and slowly he got the confidence and the ability to do it so that it looked good.
Paul Verhoeven and Rob Bottin weren't even speaking to each other during the entire course of the film. In fact, Rob stopped even coming down there at all and turned the whole thing over to what we call the Robo-Team.
Action will be everybody shooting, yeah?
Hey!
And background!
We took over 10, 12 empty buildings and dressed them and then had them rigged to explode. We were all over the city blowing things up. We're on the news every night. Something was exploding or there was something going on.
Now fill it up on number 7.
Well, the explosion at the gas station was big enough that it did manage to set the building on fire. The fire department did threaten to shut us down. And our cameraman, Jos Vacano, said, well, you know, that explosion, I don't think it's registered on film. You know, it wasn't really big enough, I think, for the camera to see. So we looked at the dailies, and what you see is what's in the film. RoboCop was a terrible experience in the production. I mean, everyone had a terrible time. It was hot. People were aggressively unpleasant. No one was getting along. The picture was over budget. It was over schedule. People from Orion would come down and say, stop the bleeding, stop the bleeding. And then they would fly off, and the next weekend they'd fly down again. And it was 6-day weeks for when we were in Pittsburgh. And people were just exhausted and ready to kill each other.
Blow this cocksucker's head off.
When I came back, people said I looked dead, and I really was white. I mean, it was really hard.
Working on RoboCop was like being the victim of a violent crime. You just try to blank it out of your mind and memory. I swore I'd never make another picture.
Fellow executives, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the future of law enforcement. Ed 209.
Ed 209 was supposed to look like these kind of weird Japanese toys that like were these big robots that had like gun arms, and I just said it looks something like that. And then I said I always had this idea that it was kind of like it had a shark mouth and it had these double machine guns, and it looked like you know, the kind of what do you call the gun pods and the rocket pods you saw on the side of Huey attack copters.
There's like a certain dumbness to it as well, something like a utilitarian stupidity to the thing.
I felt that basically having this kind of feeling that there might be sensors here, but what does he see exactly? He's partially blind for what's happening in the world, you know. Law enforcement has a side that's blind, and that basically will just do like the Germans did in the Second World War. When the commanding officers say shoot these people, they would just do it.
You know, you've got something that looks really swell, and in Ed 209's case, it does look ferocious and it does look intimidating, which was intentionally built into it, but it doesn't operate. It doesn't work very well.
It was supposed to be a big American product, you know? Again, it's a big thing, it's heavy.
Who cares if it worked or not?
Up until very recently, now that's exactly what you could say about American cars.
Because bigger is better. 6000 SUX, an American tradition.
Automobiles get styled, you know, to be emotionally, you know, appealing, and it's kind of strange that, you know, military equipment gets a little bit of that same treatment.
The front grille in Ed's face for the longest time was the opposite way it is now. It looked like he had a smile. We knew something was wrong with it. One day we went, oh yeah, if we turn the grille upside down, he has a menacing presence.
What is that grill? You wouldn't put a big radiator on the face of a tank. You know, you might as well put, you know, paint a bullseye around it and say, like, hit me here.
What we were shooting was just a prop, but it couldn't really act.
People had to go up to it or stand next to it or touch it. That was the prop.
209 is currently programmed for urban pacification.
Paul Verhoeven, he was screaming. He was like, every time the robot was supposed to be moving, you know, he would act it out. And he would run through the movements and stuff. And if people weren't afraid of a giant prop, they were certainly afraid of him.
At that time, there were no computer-generated images possible. This was just stop motion.
I didn't know anything about stop motion. I had no idea. I forgot for a long time that I had to solve that too.
There really wasn't a lot of money to work with, so we couldn't get into really any fancy blue screen photography. And the only way at that time of creating these artificial characters was either putting a guy in a suit or building a big prop or doing a stop motion animation puppet. The process of rear screen photography, which is what we used on RoboCop, you shoot a photographic background plate, project it onto a translucent screen, build a stage, put your puppet in front of that, stop motion puppet in front of that, light that puppet so that it matches the background, and have any foreground objects that you need to, and shoot that.
Phil he's like another actor, and he delivers another performance. And Ed 209 was always, to me, the kind of the clown. That whole gag of falling down the stairs, people find that so amusing that he can't go down the stairs. And I think it wouldn't have been as funny if Phil hadn't been there to do, I mean, there's a shot where the thing is reaching, it's going, and that's Phil.
We actually built a scale version of the stairs. So got all the dimensions and you know, whatnot from the staircase that they were using and matched the paint and stuff and built a miniature set, probably about 4 feet square. And we basically set the puppet up at the top of the stairs and flipped him down the stairs.
There is, I believe, 1, possibly 2 stop-motion shots of RoboCop.
When you have RoboCop right in front, he used a little miniature guy. He had to help push up the gun and blow his arm off.
The final scene where Ed walks in from off camera, and I got a call in the morning from Davison, and John said, you know, can you do something funny? So, you know, I kind of backed some stuff off and found like this little fan and glued that onto Ed 209 and just kept the stupid little whirly gig, you know, spinning the whole time. And pretty much pantomime a drunk gag, you know, where he hiccups and then he falls over and does this little
10,000 acres of wooded residential land were scorched in an instant when a laser cannon aboard the Strategic Defense Peace Platform misfired today during routine startup tests.
RoboCop to me is essentially a satire. It's a satire of the 80s. Some people say it's a satire of Reaganomics.
We've entered into a contract with the city to run local law enforcement.
But it's just a satire of that kind of era when everybody was getting rich and everybody in business were being tough and stuff like that.
There's a new guy in town. His name's RoboCop.
Bob Morton was a character that had been kicking around in my head for a while.
He doesn't have a name. He's got a program. He's product.
He's like the quintessential yuppie. He's only into consumption, he's only into excess, he's only into self-satisfaction, he's only into furthering himself, and he has no other agenda except himself, which was what many of the yuppies were criticized for back in the 1980s.
Welcome to the club, Bob.
Businessmen were reading Asian martial arts books to learn how to be better businessmen, and they were calling each other killers, and they were talking about hostile takeovers.
Now that's how it's done in the big leagues, Johnson. You see an opening, you go for it.
And so I was trying to raise it just to the thing where they really were killing each other.
I'm cashing you
It's a cliche now, but at the time it was kind of fun to watch the, you know, sort of the vicious yuppies.
Fuck Jones. He fumbled the ball and I was there to pick it up.
RoboCop was really trying to write a funny movie that was masquerading as a genre, sci-fi, Terminator kind of movie.
You probably don't think I'm a very nice guy, do you?
Buddy, I think you're slime.
Paul always said he wanted to make Murphy's death the most violent scene imaginable because you cannot have the resurrection until you have the crucifixion.
Paul really immersed himself in that part of the film, killing the hero 25 minutes in.
The figure of Jesus has always fascinated me, and the mythological narrative in the Gospels fascinates me too. When I got the script, I started to realize that in some way RoboCop had something to do, for me at least, with Jesus. These themes of crucifixion. Resurrection.
RoboCop.
Even at the end, when Murphy is walking over the water, the line that Murphy says there,
I'm not arresting you anymore.
I thought that was an American Jesus saying, okay, at a certain moment we'll use the guns. At the end, he's an American Jesus that uses his gun.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
We have to assume that Jesus himself was surrounded by people that used swords.
We killed you!
Even if I say it's an American Jesus, we have to accept that Jesus, probably at the end of his life, perhaps the last couple of months, was not so different from a Che Guevara. Jesus says, in the past I told you, you don't have to worry about anything. On the road you'll get from people what you need and whatever. But now I tell you, if you have a cloak, sell it and buy a sword. Even Jesus ultimately seemed to have promoted weapons.
Come quietly or there will be trouble.
It is more or less a machine, and later on it becomes more and more a human being.
You're a cop! Cop!
It's the classic struggle for identity, the classic struggle for people trying to assert their own individuality.
Yes, I am a cop.
And trying to retain that individuality in a world that insists on being bland and superficial and violent and knee-jerk.
His soul is real, and that makes the film, I think, so interesting. That makes this character of RoboCop so interesting.
One of the elements that was extremely important was really the scenes where Murphy visits his house.
Welcome, shopper. Let's take a stroll through your new home.
Then you get these flashes of the past. This kind of in the brain going stuff that you would participate in the brains of a half man, half robot were extremely seductive to me because I felt there nearly a theological significance, meaning the search for the lost paradise.
Did they blank his memory? How much does he remember? Who owns his personality once the memory is blanked? Those are all existential questions that I thought were really fun to explore in the script.
Do you have a name?
He's obviously in an existential dilemma. He's being driven by forces that he doesn't understand. And what it is it's just his own life. It's his own humanity. And eventually, of course, that breaks through.
RoboCop is remembering that he's not a robot, but remembering that somewhere in the part of the brain that's still alive, that he's Murphy.
He can never go back. He's always going to be something different. He's not a man, he's not a machine, he's something different. He's his own creature, maybe.
Then in a wonderful revolutionary flourish, the created turns on the creator, just like the Frankenstein myth.
You are under arrest.
But in this case, on the side of law and order.
Aiding and abetting a known felon.
Which is kind of reactionary in a way.
It became very clear that we had a character who was half machine and half human.
Can you do that, Dad?
It also became obvious that the machine elements would be represented very suitably by the synthesizer music and the electronic percussion. And the human part of the character would be represented by an orchestra to make him more human. I went through 6 or 7 themes until we finally landed upon the RoboCop march. Paul Verhoeven, he would walk around my studio like RoboCop, and he would move, you know, his arms and his head to just give me the idea of how he wanted it to be fluid. It's a pretty cool way to approach it.
And making the violence over the top made it more palatable because it becomes humorous.
I hate movies where violence is elliptic. I think to see people shooting and then you see somebody on the street or just like this without showing what damage a shot does, I don't think that's a big advantage. The original version of RoboCop that ultimately was, let's say, changed because of the MPA, the violence, of course, was much harsher in my cut.
Okay, Funzo.
Than it appeared in the theaters.
Okay, Funzo.
By making the violence less, by making the violence more elliptic, you were taking away the, let's say, nearly the burlesque or the grotesque of my staging. That was so much over the top that it was nearly kind of absurd. When the Tour 9 shoots the guy in the boardroom, it went on and on. It's the guy on the table is shot 60 times. And then the next line was...
Somebody want to call a goddamn paramedic?
And I thought that worked so well because it was completely absurd. The guy was gone, you know. There was nothing left nearly of him. It was completely exploded.
All right, don't touch him.
And then Mr. Jones comes to the old man.
I'm sure it's only a glitch. A temporary setback.
That worked all much funnier when it was over the top.
You call this a glitch?
RoboCop is really fascism for liberals. The picture has a very liberal viewpoint and does it in the most violent way imaginable.
I don't make political statements. I think that I'm really reflecting what's happening in society.
Nuke 'em. Get them before they get you.
This is my perception of the United States.
We practically are the military.
This is what I feel that's happening in the United States. I don't condemn it, and I don't admire it. It's more that I see it, and I want to portray it.
Whoa, a new time!
America without guns, that's not America.
And I don't want to hear any more talk about strike. We're not plumbers. We're police officers.
There was a police screening, and I thought the police were going to be offended that we were making fun of, you know, their life and death stuff. I really, you know, as it got closer, I got nervous. And what surprised me was they loved it.
So to have a blue-collar individual who has been stomped on by both the good guys and the bad guys come up and be empowered to do something is a very fulfilling experience for an unempowered audience.
And I remember a preview in New York, in a very rough theater, where a lot of ethnic people and pretty much blue-collar.
The summer's new superhero is America's new super hit movie, RoboCop.
It was so, let's say, fascinating to see people participate. And the American audience is always more participant in the movies than, for example, a Dutch audience. They are much more inclined to yell something to the screen, or applaud, or scream, or whatever. At the end of the movie, when the man says to RoboCop,
"Nice shooting, son. What's your name?"
the whole audience, before he could answer, yelled, "Murphy!"
I believe the Boy Scouts of America had some sort of presentation with RoboCop and Richard Nixon, and I was never really sure what the details were, but the meeting of the two just sort of boggles the mind.
When people have faith that the streets are policed by incorruptible individuals, which in a way RoboCop was, it renews a sense of community. And I think that's where the film also sort of touched people's unconscious, because they felt there was somebody out there who was not corruptible.
Pakistan is threatening my border!
That's it, Buster. No more military aid.
It's more relevant now than it was, unfortunately.
The entire outer skin will be like this.
It's titanium, laminated with Kevlar.
You can't be a Luddite. You have to just say it's here. I mean, look around you. They're all wearing the Kevlar stuff now, and we put that in RoboCop because it was the new Army stuff, and they're all going that way. The LAPD is becoming more like paramilitary forces, and they look just like peacekeeping troops, and I think it's because that's what the cities are demanding now.
We can expect 209 to become the hot military product for the next decade.
Now we have more Dick Jones vision of law enforcement, a militarism in which no secrets get out, which is really troubling when you think about it. But, that's America deserves that. It's a land of private property where everything has to be owned, serial numbered, protected, and controlled. We're addicted to a pretty bad drug called capitalism, and until we get over that, we're going to need police in the way that they are.
Thank you for your cooperation. Good night.
My name is Robert Morton. I'm the developer of the RoboCop program for OCP, and you're going to be meeting Robo in a minute. He is the most technologically advanced law enforcement product to date. I'd like you to meet him now. Now, you're only going to be able to ask him a couple of questions, okay? Not take up too much time, and I'll be right here. Robo, come on in. These men are going to talk to you for a minute, okay?
Robo, do you know why you were created?
I stop crime.
I see. Robo, I understand you have 3 prime directives. Can you tell me what they are?
Serve the public trust. Uphold the law. Protect the innocent.
Anything you'd like to add to this?
I am the future of law enforcement.
That says it all, doesn't it? Thank you, Robo. It was a good job.
Thank you.
What did I tell you? Be looking for him.
This picture takes place in old Detroit in the future. It's the story of a cop named Murphy who, in the course of his duties, gets killed. And he is rebuilt as a cyborg, part man, part machine, and he is now programmed as the future of law enforcement.
I was reading a lot of comic books for a studio. They came to me one day and said, Ed, read these comic books. We want to know what you think of comic books. And I had never really read comic books, particularly of this sort, which were of these sort of modern, neurotic superhero. Iron Man, Spider-Man, Machine Man, all these things that a guy named Stan Lee over at Marvel created. It was the superhero who had sort of trouble being a superhero. Even though he had all these powers, there was like something going on inside. So he was sort of like a superhero with a headache.
RoboCop has been looking for me and my boys because we're the ones that shot him up at the beginning. And as the film has gone along, he's discovered who we are, so he's come looking for us. And he happens to find us here. And then is in the process of arresting me, and then, since I won't give up and go along peacefully, he starts throwing me through various windows of offices in the warehouse here while he's reading me my rights.
Okay, next shot. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a little bit blood, that's natural, suppose, or is it just fake blood? Huh?
That's what we're in the process of doing, and that's what all this business comes from. So when they take me to the police station later, you know, I look something like this.
You ready? Action! I think what my influence in the style has much more to do with the way I shoot it, the editing, and the way I work with the actors, which is perhaps a little bit different from a normal action picture, because I
I spent, I think, much more time with the actors than you would normally do for an action picture.
Well, I play Bob Morton, who is a sort of up-and-coming executive for this company, OCP. The company itself is kind of scary. It's like, we are Beatrice, you know? We own the police, we own the hospital. It's great. And he's like the most ruthless, ambitious agent who ever sat behind a desk at William Morris. That's how I equate it, you know? The writer calls him a yuppie with teeth. So
no matter how sophisticated criminal technology gets, no matter how sophisticated our society gets, no matter how futuristic it becomes, there's still going to be the beat cop.
Hey, have you thought it all over? Why not make me an offer? Go!
The robot had a gun that fired a three-shot burst. So when the bad guys got shot, you not only had one bullet hole, but you had three. So you had a large hole, a large cavity, and a lot of blood. And these are extra large blood bags, but in a lot of the sequences, that's how much blood we'd use with 3 or 4 of the bullet hits to get the blood gushing and spurting off the chest cavity and the body cavities of a lot of the shots.
Ready? Action!
Thank you. All right. Well, I could hardly feel the impact. The brass of your last round hit me right on the chest. Yeah. I figured if you wanted to take a shot at me after I did this to you, I couldn't blame you.
Actually, the rigging was really superb. I hardly felt the impact of this.
Now, when those things go off, what do you feel?
Feels like, that's it. They did a super job.
Yeah.
One of my earliest recollections of robots is sitting in front of a television set when I was 4 years old watching a local Philadelphia TV show called Mr. Rivets, and it was a man in a cardboard box painted silver. Now, hopefully we've done a little better than that. We have one of the all-star teams of special effects. We have Phil Tippett, Academy Award winner, doing all the stop-motion animation on the robot Ed 209, this large armored enforcement robot, and he becomes RoboCop's nemesis during the course of the film. And I think Phil Tippett, with Ed 209, has really also done a superb robot.
Stop motion animation is a frame-by-frame process where we move the stop motion model, the arms, the legs, the feet, the tail, the eyes, the back, very infinitesimal amounts, and then we take one frame of film and repeat that process again. Take one frame of film, repeat the process, take one frame of film.
We have Pete Coran, who did all the roto effects in the Star Wars pictures. He's doing all our RoboVision shots, all the POVs of the robots. We have Rocco Joffrey, is probably the finest young matte artist in the United States, doing all our matte paintings. But I think Rob Bottin here has really designed and created one of the most interesting, most spectacular robots I've ever seen on film. Well, today we're shooting the scene where Murphy gets killed by the gang. First they blow off his hand, and then they blow off his arm, then they blow off his head. It's, Rob Bottin has created all these prosthetics, and they're quite startling. We were going to use Peter Weller to blow his head off, but we decided we may need some looping later on, so Rob Bottin has created a wonderful prosthetic, a puppet of Peter Weller, which looks exactly like him.
Go!
And it sits up and it looks around and it gets frightened and screams, and the whole back of the head blows off. Quite traumatic.
Okay, let's get out of here.
The future of law enforcement. RoboCop.
Action!
Peter Weller stars in the title role as RoboCop. The director is Paul Verhoeven.
Well, it's an action picture, I suppose, first of all, and it is. It has some other level, telling you something about the possibility of the human soul to survive everything. So it's on two levels. I think it's an action picture, and it's a picture about the human soul.
Shit. This guy is really good.
He's not a guy, he's a machine.
What are they gonna do, replace us?
And I play John Murphy, a.k.a. RoboCop, a policeman who's taken from his beat in Detroit and used as an experiment, much against his own will. He turns into a robot, a cyborg.
Nancy Allen plays Ann Lewis,
You may not like what you're going to see.
tough and athletic, yet surprisingly tender. She becomes the cyborg's one true friend.
And she is like the beauty in the Beauty and the Beast. She recognizes RoboCop, for what he really is, and finds out the secret, the mystery to RoboCop.
I was very nervous about how am I going to relate to this creature, And Peter's such a wonderful actor. I mean, there was just, sometimes I'd look at him and is there anyone there? So I think because of how good he is at his job, it made it really easy for me.
One of my earliest recollections of robots is sitting in front of a television set when I was 4 years old watching a local Philadelphia TV show called Mr. Rivets, and it was a man in a cardboard box painted silver. Now, hopefully, we've done a little better than that.
Let the woman go. You are under arrest.
You better back up, pal!
The future of law enforcement, RoboCop.
Hello, hi, hey, come on guys. There's nothing there, just give me a little bit more there.
For director Paul Verhoeven, RoboCop marks not only his first American feature, but also his initial plunge into the special demands of science fiction.
For the slates. Ready? Action! Yeah, it jumped at exactly the same moment, but we can intercut it, yeah?
I think that he wanted to make the movie, and he did make the movie for American sensibilities, not for European sensibilities. Still, the obliqueness of it and some of the humor and the wit and the social milieu that the jackpot of little goodies that he throws in is from Europe. So it's tremendously unique.
Drop the gun. You are under arrest. Thank you for your cooperation. Good night.
Sometimes it's really difficult to get these things on paper, yeah? You really have to know the writer and to talk with him and find out what is the common opinion behind what is written in the lines.
It distinguished itself from other robot movies because it's about a guy who becomes a machine. It's a very violent movie. It's sort of a comedy, I think. I mean, if you like a good robot picture, this might be it.
From the corridors of corporate corruption to the crime-infested streets, RoboCop takes dead aim at the urban underworld and tracks down his own killers. This warehouse is the setting for one of the most complex and challenging sequences in the film.
Action will be everybody shooting, yeah? So
In this climactic scene, RoboCop confronts his own executioners. The firepower, stunts, and special effects that result are truly awesome. Here, director Verhoeven consults with special effects man Dale Martin.
On action, our man's going to come in on action. You're going to see the whole wall get machine gunned and back with bullet hits. The glass will pop, the lights and all that. As he moves forward, we'll see some hits of cement, the ground, and then we'll throw some sparks off his body.
Explosive charges called squibs are placed by the special effects crew. These squibs, when detonated, simulate bullet hits. Special protective vests are used when placing squibs on actors. Here, special effects employ a jerk vest, a special harness worn by the actor with a hook protruding in the back. A wire is attached, and when the squibs explode, the wire is jerked, and the actor will be pulled backwards, giving the effect of being blown away. In complex scenes like this, the director choreographs each element separately, so the actors, camera, special effects, and stunts all work together as a cohesive whole.
Well, you have this sequence here, which is a big shootout. The robot comes in the building, kills all the baddies in the building, so that's not super dangerous. It's just it requires a number of stunt people, a lot of bullet hits, a lot of blood bags and things like that.
I'll wait, and then it will be action! Bam, 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 go!
I think you should run to see this movie. And not only because I'm in it, but because, well, we'll talk about it later. Go see it.
If I had enough money to buy the materials, that's as much as I needed.
I thought I was doing a cartoon until I saw that first really rough cut. I was like, oh my God, it's great.
I would get what the studio would consider to be the oddball project, something that didn't really fit into the traditional kind of generic frame. And RoboCop was certainly one of those pictures.
I'm the production designer, and my job was to sort of give a look to the picture and keep, what I always feel is to keep a cohesive look to the picture. There was a constant in design, very brutal, cold architecture. You'll see there's a constant line of concrete wherever we go that's just boring but linear and kind of visually interesting and structural to me. It's clean, so there's no information that you don't want to see.
Let's say you're shooting people at the base of a hill and you want to put a castle on that hill. Well, you could build one, right, and get a prop and put a lot of money into it. Or you could hire a very good matte painter, a man who could take a piece of glass and then paint at the top of the glass that castle, and then you would actually put the frame of glass in front of the camera and shoot your live action. Rocco Giaffri, who did the matte paintings for RoboCop, had a different technique. He didn't like to use glass, and he used masonite, masonry boards, and he would paint right on those, mainly because he was always dropping the glass and breaking the glass mats.
So a matte shot, in the traditional sense, the oldest way to do it, is a controlled double exposure where you shoot the live action, you're blacking out part of the frame, and black represents a lack of exposure. You go back in the darkroom, rewind that film, and reload that on a pedestal-mounted locked-off camera that's pointing at an artwork easel. And that artwork easel contains your matte painting, which is black now in the complementary portion of the frame, and it fits together like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And it takes a certain number of tests, usually about 4 to 6 camera tests before you get your painting to blend properly with the live action. In a situation with an architectural matte painting, you usually try and find areas that you'll be able to hide your blend in, and you go along with the architectural lines as best as possible. I'd rather cut into the set and paint a portion of that back in, because more often people are looking for a matte line on the outside perimeters of the set piece, not within the set itself. They were going to be shooting in Dallas, Texas, and they wanted it to look like Detroit in the near future. Bill Sandell, the production designer, and John Davison and Paul Verhoeven had singled out the City Hall in Dallas, and they wanted that to be the base of an 80-story skyscraper for their OCP building. And so together we came up with an idea of the thing looking kind of like a big arrow that was stabbed into the ground. There's a wide shot of Delta City when RoboCop's car is driving away from camera, and we actually shot across the bridge, the crossing in area there, and we matted into the existing cityscape, the OCP building, and other futuristic structures. John Davison specifically singled out his favorite shots in Forbidden Planet. He wanted the thing, especially the down angles, to just plunge infinitely, and just have this incredible depth. I believe there are only 2 matte paintings in RoboCop that aren't done completely in camera on the original negative, and those are the elevator shots because we needed to reduce the interior of the Plaza Americas to make it smaller and fit within that gigantic 80-story interior look. So those were optical reductions.
Optical reduction is when you take something of previously shot footage and actually reduce it in size to usually put it into something like a matte painting.
I'm responsible for the fall at the end of the film where Dick Jones is falling toward the street. Dick Jones is an animation puppet, a 2-foot-tall human animation stop-motion puppet in that shot. With a human being, you don't want to have him standing at attention with his arms at his sides. You want something that's going to be more in keeping with what he's actually going to be doing in the scene. And in the case of Ronny Cox falling, he was falling spread-eagled and kicking on the way down, so I had his arms out to the side, and a slight crouch on him is how the sculpture was done over the top of the armature with plasticine clay. And that finished clay sculpture, you'll make a plaster mold. The clay is thrown away, and the armature is taken back down to bare bones metal again. That empty armature is placed inside this mold that's been cleaned out and scrubbed, and those two halves are again put back together. The foam will be injected into the mold when the two halves are joined together with the armature inside of that. And that, in turn, is baked like a cake in an oven at 350 degrees for a number of hours until the moisture is evacuated from the foam rubber mixture, and the thing is allowed to cool down. You pull the two mold halves apart, you end up with a rubber puppet, a very nice soft foam rubber puppet that's a likeness from the clay sculpture that you did, and then it's up to you to clean that up, paint the thing, put in some eyeballs, and dress it up in the three-piece suit. This is just a typical example of an old-fashioned stop-motion puppet. It's either hinge joints in some places or ball and socket joints. I'm just going to crank this open so you can get a look at typically what a ball joint looks like here for stop motion.
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
Since RoboCop was effectively a man in a suit, Ed 209 could not be in any way a man in a suit. So that's one of the reasons we chose to offset the hips or do things that would be clearly impossible for a person to fit in that. That's why his hips are so far apart. It's one of the reasons that there's rails. The joints don't have a standard, knee joint. They've actually got a linear rail kind of a system that's, again, a one step further away from a person in a suit.
I felt that they knew so much more about it, and they came with the proposals. Then when they came with proposals, I could easily say, okay, but then do this, If we do it this way, then let's make this strange thing they had built, which is a gray area. Let's make that the eyes, the whole eyes. These are the eyes. There's hundreds of eyes. Basically, whatever it is, they can see through that, not by a little camera on the top of his head,
For the inspiration for Ed 209, we drew upon kind of a number of different areas, tried to try something in the natural world. So killer whales were something that had a pretty menacing kind of a countenance. Everything's kind of an excuse. There's a big air intake, and it looks a lot like a mouth. And there's this big dome that you can't really see where the eyes are. The idea there was that this would be maybe like an anti-laser surface. This is kind of the maquette stage, and it really is pretty instrumental. The last round of design until you blow this thing up to full scale. This is like basically, it's blue foam, it's house insulation foam. You take that, it's cheap and stuff. And you can mix with my favorite toothpicks and soda straws. You kind of build a little version of the robot that you can talk about. The leg, upper leg would be here. It could pivot, and then also, in order to take a step, the guy could actually shoot his leg forward, and then kind of, as he's walking forward, do this. So that was pretty critical. You could see through it. There were lots of moving parts. There was a big screw that would be responsible for moving the leg up and down, and then like on the back here, a little bit of a plate, the screw access. And we figured since we're going to have a screw that's in there turning, we might as well put a detail on there. So I modeled the end of the screw to look like one of the axles you see on a railroad car. So as the guy's actually moving, you see these little things spinning.
The full-scale Ed 209 was a design that Craig had come up with, working with Paul Verhoeven and myself, and trying to get something that Paul was happy with as a character, a nemesis for RoboCop.
The crew that we were building at this time, Pete Ronzani, Neil Breitbart, and Paula Lucchesi, my girlfriend at the time, we pretty much built that thing together. And it was hell, but it was one of those experiences you come through, and at the end of the day, it's something we always remember. Later on, we became married, and so I guess it didn't really split us apart. All the forms were built up out of wood. You know, we used a lot of plywood, masonite, and just fur, and actually kind of built up patterns and stuff bit by bit. We used a lot of plastic forming techniques and fiberglass techniques. And seeing how it was basically the middle of summer in San Rafael, we were pretty much in hell, up to our ears in fiberglass, and wearing these suits, because you have to wear these protective suits and respirators and everything else while it's just blistering hot. It's a pretty tough portion there. One of the keys with movie props is they've got to be pretty flexible. You have to be able to put this thing together and take it apart in relatively short order. And actually, that's one of the things I'm pretty proud about, was the model was held together with bungee cords, snaps, and different techniques. So basically, 2 people could take the thing apart. We were pretty much left alone. In fact, for the full-scale prop, you know, I don't think Paul saw it at all until it was delivered, you know, in Dallas. That was pretty cool. I felt pretty trusted. Phil Tippett would check in on us on a periodic basis, come over and see what we're doing, and just kind of roll his eyes at the mess we were making and stuff. You know, our hearts were in it so much that, you know, compensation even wasn't necessarily important. Just, you know, contributing to this whole kind of process was really the motivation. The full-scale prop was essentially just that, a prop. You know, it was capable of being posed. The head could be swiveled, you know, from side to side. The arms were able to be pivoted. We could rotate them down or rotate them up. But it was really the kind of thing that had limited, very, very limited motion. Because of the size of the big guy, his head was so big that even though we made this pretty reinforced fiberglass mold, it still sagged a little bit. So when you see the big one compared to the miniature version is built exactly off the pattern for the big one. But when we molded the big one, it squished just a little bit. So the big guy's head's just a little bit fatter than the miniature version. And actually, it's one of those things that always bugged me when I saw it in the film, because I recognized they were a little different. But what are you going to do?
Phil Tippett is the man on RoboCop who actually animated the stop-motion puppets for Ed 209.
This is the stop-motion miniature of the Ed 209 puppet that has an articulated stop-motion skeleton or armature in it. And this is actually, part of it's actually visible here. And you can see this lead screw mechanism that was part of the design that Craig Hayes had come up with.
Then they've made a number of miniature puppets that were articulated and had little skeletons inside of them of metal so you could pose them, and then this was done through stop motion animation.
Every little aspect of this particular character has got an armatured, jointed part that allows, and shooting one frame of film can, depending upon the complexity of the shot, take, you know, anywhere from 10 minutes to, you know, an hour and a half, you know, adjusting everything properly for one frame of film.
You get your camera, you take one frame, stop the camera, you go onto the little stage, move the arm infinitesimal inch, go back behind the camera, shoot another frame, one frame at a time.
Most of the work for Ed 209 was stop-motion animation, with the exception of the staircase scene, and in particular when he falls down the staircase. The staircase that Ed 209 fell down was a 4-foot square miniature, built of plywood and brass and, you know, the usual kind of model building materials, reinforced so that when the guy fell down the stairs, it didn't shake the set too much. Phil did all of the kind of masterminding of exactly how we were going to do that, what angle the set would be at to get the best roll and everything. And then we rigged up the puppet with the pin in his foot, and when we said go, camera was rolling at speed, we'd pull the pin and the robot would tumble down the stairs and off the edge of the set. I was the one catching the robot because I was the one who had to fix it up for the next take, so I wanted to make sure as little stuff broke, you know. So I'd be down there trying to make sure the little thing didn't hit the ground and break off an important part, and then I'd have more work to do.
I came up with this technique that Craig Hayes helped me with, where I thought, you know, I don't want everything to go through like a secondary optical pass. I want everything to be on the original negative, if that was possible.
For Ed 209's, you know, machine guns, we rigged up photographic flashes.
And then while I was animating the Ed 209, you animate one frame at a time, one frame at a time, one frame at a time, getting ready to cock his guns or whatever.
I took some Minolta flashes apart and rigged up a system where we could put the actual flash tube into the tip of the barrel of Ed 209's gun.
And backwind the camera one frame and turn all the lights off on the set.
And then we would take cotton, take some you know, colored plastic gel, wrap some orange around the thing, and then take some cotton and sculpt what would look like a muzzle flash.
And they'd go off. Boom.
So that you get this thing that looked like a burned in kind of a muzzle flash.
I put like tons of diffusion on the camera too, for those particular frames, not the rest of the stuff, but just for the frames where the flashes were going off. So it didn't look like cotton, it looked like more of a diffused flash. And then I just like randomly put different shapes in the cotton so it had the characteristic effect of gunfire.
It was a pretty interesting technique, but because of the high voltages, involved in the sort of somewhat, movie-ish quality of the wiring, occasionally they'd get a few thousand volt shock.
And I'd be like working away on the thing, and he never insulated these things well enough. I'd be like right in the middle of doing this thing, and you'd hear the scream, ah! And I was just gonna get like these, whatever, like 10,000 volts going through me. It was really wild.
I'd been through enough shocks myself that I kind of found it amusing, but I don't think they appreciated that at all.
Everything's very clear, and you get electrocuted.
And this is a shot where we actually made a little miniature RoboCop. So this was a stop-motion RoboCop that grabs the gun, and Ed Tuonai is firing as he gets his arm pointed over to his own arm and actually blows his arm off. This was kind of an interesting shot to achieve because of the way the robot, it's one of the things, the limitations of the robot. He actually technically couldn't shoot his own arm because his head was in the way. So we ended up sort of cheating, and you don't see it in the movie, but we unhooked the arm and just kind of pulled it out to the point where he could do it. And, it's all a big phony thing. So this shot of him launching his missiles, he had this giant blown off arm, which was a practical part that built out in San Francisco. I had to fly it out to Dallas, and I remember as Phil and I were going out there, I had this big giant blown off robot arm wrapped in some paper and stuff, and they asked me what it was at the airport. And I didn't want to say it was a big giant blown off robot arm, so I said it was a planter, and they said, okay, just put it in there. It's hard to imagine these days, getting a giant blown off arm, through any kind of airport security, but back then it was like whatever.
I thought for sure that I'd be able to continue doing matte paintings with a paintbrush and camera trickery for the rest of my life.
Since RoboCop, yeah, the industry, visual effects in particular, have changed so radically.
In the digital world, you're in an arena where you have your frame and you can do anything you want with it. You don't have to go have a separate camera shoot something else. You can create it in the digital world right there, and you can put it into the frame right there.
With the advent of computer graphics and Photoshop matte paintings, the cut and paste methods, and just using photo collage, matte painters could, for the most part, start coming out of the woodwork. People that couldn't create a realistic painting with their hands and with a paintbrush were suddenly, there's just like tons of matte painting artists now.
There's a completely different kind of realm of equipment that's necessary, and the accessibility, of course.
These days, visual effects are done in a variety of ways. You can create something completely from scratch in the computer, build 3D models and light them and so forth, and do that all entirely in the machine.
You can go to a store and you could buy the software, the hardware, most of the stuff that you would need to actually do visual effects.
I don't know if there was if there really is a need for doing stop motion anymore.
Stop motion animation is still around, but certainly in a far diminished capacity.
In regards to doing visual effects work, I think it's it's been replaced by computer graphics pretty much.
I found that by the late 1990s, by 1997, that early in that year, that for the most part, any phone call that I got requesting a matte painting shot, they wanted to know for sure that I was doing it with computer graphics.
It's a completely different world.
That's the way of Hollywood and the film industry. The technology only reflects, what's current, and it's constantly being replaced.
You can watch the film nowadays, and the shots do hold up.
One of the biggest compliments for me on the whole project was when my friends who really didn't understand what we did would come over, walk up to this thing and kick it, and it was hollow. They'd be shocked. They thought it was a 4-ton giant robot that we had built.
They're actually artists who happen to be working with very sophisticated special effects.
Bad guys never think they're bad guys.
Villains are a lot more fun.
And all the blood that went flying around was just a kind of gravy on the cake. Gravy on the cake. There was that particular street in Dallas, and it was a neighborhood, I guess, that was scheduled to be torn down anyway. And we really tore it down and blew it up and smashed it and destroyed it completely. We had these big big cannons that they designed for us. We got very used to hauling them around and shooting them. And they made really gloriously big explosions.
It's primarily a gun that's intended to be fired on a tripod. It's not intended to be picked up and carried around unless you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he wasn't in this movie. So
we had some phony ones that were like made out of a kind of a styrofoam material.
Sometimes we would be using the dummy, and the dummy, of course, weighed nothing. So then that's when the acting came in, because then you had to make it look as heavy as the real one did, so you didn't look too stupid all of a sudden. Because every time we had to like fire it, it had to obviously be the real gun.
Paul was always for new ideas, and if we could destroy something in a better way, he was all for it. Explosions are memorable to me. The one where Clarence Bodiger and I are leaning up against the car, and that whole big storefront explodes into a fiery mass.
So the thing was that whatever the cue was, we go across the street, and then they blow it. This big fireball comes out and follows us.
There were little pieces of debris that embedded themselves in the right side of my face in that one.
It got to my coat, and my coat, my coat was smoldering. They came and pulled the coat off, and you could feel the heat, but I didn't really realize it was getting to my clothes.
And I believe they gave me a stunt adjustment for that.
They came and said, well, we hadn't intended for it to be quite that big an explosion. We're sorry about it, so we've decided we wanted to give you stunt pay.
After I got that extra $300 or $400, I tried to devise ways where I could get closer to the explosions.
It was just a great summer. Summer of '86. We were all in the same hotel. We'd all hang out in the same bar afterwards.
We went to dinner together most of the time.
It was like the best summer camp ever.
Downtown Dallas, at least in 1986, there wasn't really anything down there. 5 o'clock and everybody left town, and that was pretty much it. There's tumbleweeds blowing through the street, and actors wandering around looking for something to do. We pretty much hung out together, and I think that feeling played onto the set as well. We really kind of felt like a unit, and we had fun doing what we were doing.
It was a fairly young group, and we were pretty boisterous, as I recall.
Paul just let us go crazy.
I remember that when we were at the steel mill, that's when we were really bored, because we were in our 3rd or 4th month of the film, and we were in Monessen, Pennsylvania, and there was nothing there. There was nothing to do, and we used to steal the golf carts, that the ADs use.
Yeah, you couldn't leave a golf cart around us.
We would steal them and have races around the steel mill. And then the ADs were constantly angry at us, and trying to find their golf carts. And they didn't think it was funny at all.
We were just like little boys playing in a big sandbox. I just liked Leon's style. One day I came in and read for Paul Verhoeven. And then I think he felt that I could be one of the good bad guys. I liked the way he dressed, and I liked that little piece of jewelry that he had at the eyeball. I also felt that he was probably the best looking of the bunch. Don't touch me, man! He knew how to have a good time, old Leon did.
Can you fly, Bobby?
Clarence, no!
Actually, they brought me in for Dick Jones and for Clarence.
I always wanted to play Clarence, and Kurtwood did a wonderful job, and I'm not taking anything away from him, but I sure would have liked to have had a shot at that one.
I read the script pretty quickly and thought, B-movie, but fun. Looks like it's be real fun. I didn't know who the director was, didn't know anything about it, just went in and read. My agent called, and I had the part. And I thought she was talking about Dick Jones when we were working out the details and stuff, and then she said something. I said, wait a minute, what part is this? She said, well, it's Clarence. For me, to be getting to do something a little bit different was very exciting. I can't remember where along the line I found out about the reason that I had been cast and exactly what they were looking for.
I had to refer to things I knew about from Europe, isn't it? I mean, I grew up in the Second World War, and Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS in Germany. I thought the prototype of a criminal is Heinrich Himmler for me. Clarence Bodiger should look a little bit with Heinrich Himmler, and that was the little glasses we gave him,
He was smart, and that's always scary. If you see some kind of big bruiser in a movie and this and that, you always figure you can outsmart him. But when somebody's really a cold-hearted bad guy, who can also think, then you know you're in trouble, and then it's a little terrifying.
Clarence Boddicker was a guy who was about shotguns and hand grenades, and was kind of you know, a pretty tough guy that way, and didn't care about killing innocent people at all.
I felt that it was essential that Clarence be a character who never backs off, and he had a sense of humor. Now, it's a macabre sense of humor, it was a vicious sense of humor. Sense of humor. I wanted Clarence to have more of a revolutionary look than a street gang leader look. We just went shopping. We went to Army surplus stores and then high-end eyeglasses stores and fashion stores where we'd get like really expensive boots.
Kurtwood Smith was extremely creative, I felt, you know, and a lot of his ideas we used.
Kurtwood used to come to the set and just have some ideas, and they would always be good.
The first scene I ever shot in the movie was when RoboCop drags me in and throws me on the desk and says, "Book him." And I was supposed to just say, give me my phone call. I went up to Paul just before we shot it and said, well, what if I spit blood on the desk and then say, give me my fucking phone call? And Paul goes, you want to spit blood? Yes, let's try it.
Yeah, I was immediately a fan of that, clearly, isn't it? My style includes basically these kind of disgusting things.
Well, I didn't really know at that point, because it was my first day, I didn't know what a sort of blood freak Paul was with regard to the movie, as we found out later.
Shit. Just give me my fucking phone call.
The corporate villains we really enjoyed writing. These are people who are clearly out of touch with reality. They only live above the 50th floor.
It's a better plan. Fucking Jones. I'd go straight to the old man if I could.
Don't mess with Jones, man. He'll make sushi out of it.
Is Bob Morton a villain? I guess he's an up-and-coming villain who doesn't quite get his day.
Bob Morton is a terrific role. The guy was just deliciously avaricious. He was just fantastic. He was like every Hollywood junior agent you've ever met. The casting director for RoboCop was one woman named Sally Dennison, who I'd known for a while, and she wanted me to come in and read for one of the gang guys. And I read the script, and I said, you know, I'd love to do that for you, but I'd really rather do this other guy, this executive guy. And she said, oh, I never would have thought of you for that, but okay. So weeks passed, and I figured it had all been forgotten, and I finally got a chance to go in and met Paul and everyone, and then I came back a second time, me and just one other guy, and, you know, it worked out.
Perhaps you're aware of the RoboCop program developed by myself at Security Concepts as a contingency against just this sort of thing?
In the script, he was supposed to look kind of like a nerd or a loser before the Ed 209 incident, before he proposed the RoboCop, and then after he was successful. Ed Neumeier's idea was to really have a radically different look, and we didn't find a way to really make that work.
The very first scene we shot in the entire picture was the bathroom scene.
Ronny and I really had an idea of how to do this, which is the way it sort of played out on screen, to make it almost like a seduction in the beginning, and he grabs my hair. We showed it to Paul, and Paul just loved it. He said, that's very sick, isn't it? Yes, I like it.
You just fucked with the wrong guy. Out of your fucking mind.
It was Ronny's idea to really have that turn on it instead of a straight-ahead confrontation, which was interesting.
I think it's one of the most powerful scenes, and I think it sets his character up in a really good way, and I think it sets my character up in a really good way.
I think the character of Bob Morton is definitely pissed, but definitely scared, because when Ronny says you just fucked with the wrong guy, it's, you know, he's seen some bodies buried before. But I think his overriding greed and confidence actually makes him believe that he's going to get away with it because he's smarter. So, I mean, the guy really got to do everything. He started out in the beginning of the movie as really quite an underdog, took an opportunity, rose to power, success. His life changed. All of a sudden he had money and girls, nice clothes, and then it all went south on him.
I'm cashing you out.
my agents had called me up and said, Ronny, would you like to go in and do this film? And I got to tell you, my agent said, I don't think it's a very good film, but it said it's a chance for you to play a villain. I'd spent my whole career playing Mr. Nice Guy, and had always played just the sensitive fellow next door. Since I had been in a number of films where I've always played sort of sympathetic guys, it gave us the element of surprise, which is always my favorite, because so many times with villains you sort of know where they're coming from. And with me playing him, you sort of wanted to try to like him at first, and then there was nothing to like. Oddly enough, with Dick Jones, I looked for every good thing about him. I always looked for the opposites. When I played all of those sympathetic nice guys, I always looked for the rough edges on those guys. And with Dick Jones, I just looked at this, and I really sort of looked at the world through his prism. I bought into what he was saying, and then once I did that, I tried to play him as simply and as straightforwardly as possible. Obviously, Ed 209 was far superior to RoboCop. I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, of course it had a couple of design flaws, but we can work that out.
I'm sure it's only a glitch, a temporary setback.
The only guy I'm worried about here is the old man. Guys like you, no worries.
I got him, Clarence! I got him!
Well, in RoboCop, I get blown up to smithereens, and there's nothing left of me. And you know, there was a dummy up there, up in that crane control booth, and but dressed in my clothes. So when they actually blew him up, and then they took the tattered clothes off the dummy and gave them to me. I still have them. They hang in my closet, in my room, in my bedroom, wrapped in plastic, like Laura Palmer was.
Those explosions knocked me down, and actually made me physically ill. I wasn't, you know, I've had squibs 1,000 times in movies. Never anything quite like that.
So finally, when he gets me in the neck, then what they had done was they ran a hose from way over there. That was the other thing as well. I was staggering around in the water, overacting up a storm. I had to make sure I didn't pull my hose, because the hose had the blood in it, and it ran under the water, you know, up my pants legs, up my wrist. So when I grabbed it right here, where all the blood is pumping out of my wrist, actually, and onto my neck.
The moment among villains I thought worked best was when Bob Morton was killed. He's there with the two call girls and the cocaine, and Clarence shows up with the DVD of Dick Jones, giving him the speech about how he has to die. So you have three villains in one place.
You know, Paul is Dutch, and Joost Vacano, the cinematographer, is German. And
I don't believe that Paul knew during that evening that bitches was a pejorative term for females.
We were getting ready to do the scene, and so we were kind of blocking it out, and Paul says, yeah, Kurtwood says, bitches leave, then the bitches leave, and bitches, then you leave when he says that. And then he says, no, wait, bitches, don't leave, wait. Joost, what do you think? Should bitches leave when he says bitches leave, or should they wait for him to make a motion? Joost goes, the bitches should leave. Yeah, bitches. Bitches, you leave. Miguel and I are just sitting there cracking up. And the bitches, they didn't seem to have a problem with it at all. You know, they were like, okay, fine, sure.
Very good, thank you, bitches. Very good, that's a wrap on the bitches. Thank you very much, bitches.
I couldn't resist sticking my tongue in the ring and pulling it out with my teeth.
This is the second time that Kurtwood had killed me in a movie. And, you know, it's been 20 years, and I really think it's time for me to kill him.
Flashpoint Miguel is in, and I kill him in that movie, too. So he has sworn vengeance on me.
Gotta try to make that happen. This movie absolutely changed my life.
It's done well for me. I mean, it opened doors at that time.
Didn't make me much money for a long time.
I don't think any of us knew how really how well it would turn out. I think everyone was surprised.
It made me sort of a character actor to be seen at auditions. And, you know, when you're looking for people, then, you know, I became one of those people. In this business, acting, especially character acting, you need to have a good role in a successful film.
It was fun playing that guy.
God bless that robot movie.
The three most important elements of RoboCop were the screenplay, the director, and the robo-suit.
How was I to convey the robotics of a machine and the humanity of a man at the same time?
We spent a big chunk of change, I don't remember, it might have been $1 million on that suit.
The danger of this character was that someone would say, well, you're not going to see his face, so you can put anybody in there. And I think that that's not true. You needed a real actor and who really took it seriously, and Peter really did. Peter, you know, took it seriously from a physical standpoint. He studied mime, and he did this, and he developed this whole thing. And in retrospect, you can't imagine the movie without Peter.
It was anyhow difficult to find the actor because we needed somebody, as has been pointed out several times. I mean, somebody was a really good jawline, isn't it? Because this is what you see only this, isn't it?
Weller was probably the best person we could get. He was a marathon runner. He was very skinny. And so when you put him in the suit, he looks like a normally proportioned person. But if you put an actor with a normal physique inside that suit, he looks too big.
He really captures the feeling of the robot, physically, you know, vocally, everything. And you really feel like he's solid as a rock. And yet, you know, he had to really work very hard at that to make you have that feeling.
Orion and Mike Medavoy, my friend and a great supporter through the years, said, why don't you just find a mime teacher? I was living in New York at the time, still do. And so I interviewed 5 or 6 teachers of mime, and I talked to this really gifted gentleman named Moni Yakin, who's head of the movement department at Juilliard, and he read the script, and he wanted to incorporate dance and a fluidity in it, and not just this staccato pantomime, and so I went with him, and we prepped for about 7 months. I put on football gear and would walk around Central Park and work with Moni.
Rob Bottin, of course, the genius really, who's responsible for the beautiful look of that suit and the functionality of it, always works in clay, full size.
We used to go to Rob's probably once a week, maybe twice a week in the early days of the design phase.
Somehow, suddenly we started to look at Japanese comic books and stuff like that, and then we started to change the design.
So every time they would change their mind about the overall concept of this character, that meant that Rob Bottin would have to go out and get a whole new 6-foot piece of clay and then sculpt a very detailed statue of what the final thing was going to look like, which in itself was very time-consuming.
The drawings that Rob submitted initially were almost exactly, you know, what we ended up doing. I mean, there's small refinements along the way, but I would say that Rob just took it and just said, here, this is it, and everybody kind of looked at it and went, wow, that's cool.
It's a bunch of different pieces, about approximately 2 dozen, but they're very simple. You just put them on one at a time. Essentially, what you're seeing is pieces hung from the actor. What there is under this chest plate is a harness. And there's a harness that hangs from the shoulders and goes across the back and across the chest. And these pieces here were literally hung on this harness and snapped on in the back. The legs were leggings that you could actually pull on like long socks. And then you had the shoes, which had little sneakers inside of them, so that you could slip your feet in those, and then they would be secure. The hands, which were supposed to be metal, were actually a kind of a foam rubber glove that just slipped on. And then again, these pieces were just kind of snapped on in like half sections. To get something that's as nice and as pretty and as effective as this was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. From the moment that they started designing the suit to the day that they actually delivered the final one was an 8-month process.
After I had done the casting with Rob Bottin for the suit and for the face, we did not get a chance to try out this suit before we had to shoot with it.
They had done a full body cast of Peter Weller. Then molds were pulled from the body cast. And so all the pieces basically were made for Peter's body.
So I had been shooting in Dallas for 2 weeks, the non-robotic part of the film. And then the suit arrived, and Rob and his entire coterie showed up.
And at that point, it took 8 hours to put Peter Weller into the suit.
It took us about 10 hours to put on the suit the first time.
And it took, well, 11 hours to get him into the suit the first time.
Moni Yakin and I had developed this very fluid-like, this legato, if you will, style of movement, almost like a snake. When the suit came and it was as heavy as it was, and we were already shooting, I could hardly move in it.
So you had two problems the very first day. The suit is very late, and the suit doesn't work, at least not for Peter.
Putting on the suit for the first time depressed me possibly more than anything except the end of a love affair 20 years ago that I can remember.
They had to shave something off here just a little bit. Maybe they would have to break a piece off and then re-glue it over here. It was all just to make it work on Peter Weller.
Once he removed the armpits and the knees and part of the heels of the feet and the neck, then I could start to work the outer shell of the suit more freely. But that still didn't give me the fluid-like movement that Moni and I had worked on for 7 months.
And Peter, quite rightly, became very vocal in his insistence that he be given some time to try to figure out how now to work with this suit.
Arguments ensued, what are we going to do? I had my percentage of stuff to say, believe me in it, as did Rob and Paul.
So they actually shut down the production for 2 days. So after the first day, we were suddenly 2 days behind. And those 2 days, Peter Weller and Moni and Paul Verhoeven all worked very closely together to come up with a new way of Peter to move.
We started to move the suit, and Paul started to shoot tests on it. And Moni took me inside and said, look, slow everything down. It's no longer a snake, it's a beast. It's got to be big, and the accents have to be huge. The dissection and the definition of the ends of these movements have to be absolutely staccato and not legato. The head has to move like bang.
We'd see Peter out there in the parking lot, you know, marching around with this, you know, with his movement coach to make it look right, you know, and it made a big difference.
He needed that time, and rightly so, and I think we were pissed off at him that he was, let's say, in our opinion, obstructive, but I don't see it that way anymore at all.
That warehouse, I just remember how difficult it was to breathe in there by the end of the day. And then as soon as I felt really, really sorry for myself, as I said, this was also in August and it was really hot, then I just look over at Peter Weller, and he would be in that RoboCop suit, which was like built on a wetsuit, you know, and he'd just be sitting there with hoses, air hoses stuck down in.
He was constantly having to rehydrate himself. And so there was always the danger that, you know, these horrific conditions might take out our star.
He'd lose 8 to 10 pounds a day. You know, just in dehydration, then he'd have to put it on at night. Whenever I felt bad, I'd just look at Peter and I didn't feel nearly as bad.
Peter's gonna hate that I say this, but I don't care. All the cast and crew got memoranda saying, on the set, don't refer to Peter as Peter or Mr. Weller. Don't call him by anything other than Murphy or Robo, depending on who he's playing that day. And I'd known Peter for 10 years prior, so I was like, pfft. Are you kidding me? You joking? So we used to tease him. You know, he'd be sitting there in the suit in between takes, and I said, Pete, what's happening, man? What's going on? And he'd ignore me. I said, Pete, I'm talking to you. I said, Peter, I'm talking to you. I know no one named Peter. He would actually try to say that. I said, oh, come on. And by the way, is that the voice you're using, really? Is that how you're going to do it? Okay.
In the beginning, he was so mad at the actor that he didn't want me to call him Peter, but I had to address him like RoboCop. But I couldn't. I thought it was so silly. I just couldn't do it, you know. I said, I'm mad at the actor or not, I can't do it, I can't do it.
He dropped that after a couple of weeks, but it was pretty funny.
The suit was ready when it was ready. And Paul became accustomed to that he couldn't rush these guys, because the second that we'd cut, immediately, like a team of Ferrari mechanics, these guys would go to work on me.
They designed this fake car built on a platform, and when they finally got the prototype there, they were very surprised to find that Peter Weller in the suit wouldn't fit in the car.
Getting into the car, you couldn't get into the car with the legs. It was too much suit to get into a car. This suit, which I first thought was cumbersome and lugubrious, slowed me down and made the beast of this guy, like Moni said, come through. So when we were working this, Moni would say, you know, it'd be great if, and he stayed for 2 weeks, it'd be great if you like move the shoulder and then the head, or move the chest and then the head, or move the head and then the chest.
I felt that The Man in the Iron Mask and other stories that involved kind of political repression of the hero were central to the way we developed the story. The Man in the Machine has been a classic story in science fiction, and when you consider that he's trapped in there with human memories, human emotions, that becomes a very important identification for the audience. When will he speak? When will he recognize himself?
I did an adjustment in the voice. It's softer. If you go back and look at it, it's just a little bit softer. It's not, thank you for your cooperation. It's, can you help me adjust? It's a little more of this. It's coming back to him. The real transformational moment is when I take off that helmet and I say that I feel them, but I can't remember them. The linear thought process is probably gone, but the sense of the thing, the sense of humanity is there.
The leg that holsters the gun, of course, was a separate cable-controlled piece, so it was never incorporated into the costume. It was a standalone.
It was designed so that guys off camera could actually push and pull with cable controls, and they would pull a cable like this, and it would actually open up a latch and a spring, and pop, it would pop out. And there was the gun already hidden inside of it. And so then when they wanted to do the opposite of closing it, they would just pull the other cable and poof, it would go back in. Robo also had what was called the terminal strip. That's that very wicked looking spike that comes out of his wrist when he pops his arm out like this. And it's basically to interface him with any kind of computer or any kind of electronic equipment that he can exchange data with. The whole terminal strip apparatus was a completely separate cable-controlled arm that was held up by offstage technicians to make it look like Peter Weller was doing it, but he wasn't.
When he gets me with the spike in the neck, it was actually somebody else's hand down there. There were Peter and I, and then there was another person down there with the, with the false hand with the spike popping out. You're down there fighting somebody to the death, and then there's another person crawling along beside with a false hand.
That whole arm was actually a working replica too, and that was something, again, that was constructed by the Robo team specifically before that shot. And again, operated by cable controls off camera, and the hand could move and the fingers could move, and yes, it could shake hands, but it couldn't crush your hand like it shows in the picture. Actually, it had a pretty good grip, surprisingly, but not enough to pulp somebody.
The hands were rubber gloves. So every time we threw the car keys, they would bounce out of the rubber gloves. And we must have shot this 50 times. And I think that was it for the day. That was it. We'd been there 14 hours or something. And finally we got a shot where Peter anticipated the keys and caught them and turned around, walked out the door. And that was a day's shooting.
The heaviest part of the entire suit was the helmet, because the helmet was made out of fiberglass and basically neoprene, which is a oxygen-impregnated rubber that is used in wetsuits for diving. And that's what a lot of the blacks were too. It was like neoprene. It's like a very thin rubber that you can cut and scissor.
Walking down those stairs in that discotheque, though, was only the head and the chest. But still, Robo isn't like looking at his feet, oh, there's stairs down there, I think I have to walk down them. Robo is a computer-driven machine. He knows where the next step is. So I had to walk down these steps with all of that smoke and that music pounding, and Joost Vacano following me or leading me with a camera. and not look at the steps. And the steps were only about 8 inches in depth. And that was hairy, because if I took a tumble on that, there could have been broken necks and everything else. And I did that 3 times.
Leon Nash was in the discotheque enjoying himself, as only Leon can. He wasn't expecting this Robo character to come into the discotheque and pick him up and arrest him. And of course, then he did the most stupid thing in the world. He tried to kick him in the groin. And that doesn't work for RoboCop. I'm not exactly sure what that area is composed of. And I never saw it that closely, but it was hard on the foot.
Seeing his eyes and not seeing his eyes was a big debate between all of us. So the gunshot, when we see an eye, is a very important step towards stripping away the mask of the character.
Robotine and Paul Verhoeven and Ed Neumeier had all come up with the concept that there would be such a potential for psychological disruption. Even if you would supposedly wipe someone's memories and emotions, they still might have some kind of residual humanity, where if they looked at themselves as a complete robot with no relation to their past organic form, they'd completely freak out and have a psychotic breakdown. So the idea was that surgeons had literally skinned off Alex Murphy's face and then placed it on the cyborg. So it's not like they transplanted his head, they just took his face off and laid it on the cyborg, and that was to give him his own little sense of identity. Basically, there was a shell, a plastic shell that fit on the back of Peter Weller's head that looked like the back of the RoboCop head. And then there was a separate breakaway piece that was done specifically for the moment when he pulls his helmet off. Underneath, they had put a bald cap on Peter so that his hair was gone, and then they had extended out these little foam pieces to the edges of his face, so it looks like they were literally stapled or layered onto the metal.
Stéphane Dupuis, this gifted human being who applied that face, that was a 6.5 hour sit for me, 6.5 hours for one piece of prosthesis. Stéphane would take 3.5 hours to put it on. He would take a break. I do Zen meditation, so I'd meditate in this chair. But the 27 days or the 21 days that we did that face, after the break, Stéphane would come back and then he would do the makeup. In those days, after 6.5 hours, I would shoot for 5 or 6 hours because that's all that face would tolerate before the rubber would start to come off. I would be going to work at 2:30 in the morning sometimes, while the crew would be coming in from partying because they know they would have a late call, because old Weller would be in that chair with Stéphane for the next 6.5 hours, and there's another hour and a half of that suit. So I'd be working an 8 or 9 hour day before the film was even burned.
There was a gun that we had initially got for RoboCop. It's called an Israeli Desert Eagle, and it's the gun that is in the boardroom that is pulled out of the box that is used to threaten Ed 209, and later Ronny Cox pulls out to hold the old man hostage. That gun, which is was a kind of a new gun at the time and had an interesting look, and is really a big gun. When you put it in RoboCop's hand, it looked like a cat pistol.
This is a Beretta 93R, an actual firearm made by the Beretta company in the mid-'80s that was modified by the weapons master, the person who was in charge of all the armory on RoboCop, and that was a Texan named Randy Moore.
It was an unusual gun because it was developed as an anti-terrorist gun back when terrorists weren't what they are now, and it could fire multiple shots.
There's a little switch on the side of a real Beretta that allows you to flick it up, and then when you squeeze the trigger, you're not just shooting one shot, you're shooting 3 at the same time.
It was an automatic pistol, and it was big, and so we sat down one afternoon and we designed some stuff to go on it to make it look even bigger and meatier. And I remember saying, well, the front of it should look like a sarcophagus because it's death. And you know, one thing led to another, and there it was. And he made it, and 2 days later he came up to my hotel room and he said, you want to see it? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay, well, let's go in the bathroom and we'll fire it off. And, you know, we'll close the door. And now, if you did this now, they'd arrest you, put you under the jail. But so we go in the bathroom, we close the door, and he fires this thing off, and it's as big as, it puts powder everywhere in the room. The mirror is covered with gunpowder, and it sets off the smoke alarm on the other side of the wall, and it was astounding.
He extended the barrel out here, put these nice flanges on the side, and then also drilled holes on the side so that when the gun fired, you would not only get a tongue of flame from the barrel, but also from each side, so it would look really cool and spectacular and intimidating on film.
Well, I grew up in West Texas, and I grew up around guns. And when I was a high school kid, I was a fast drawer. I could twirl the 9mm as Murphy. But this gun came along. This gun's a very special gun. It was an automatic weapon. It was a fully automatic 9mm weapon designed by Beretta, as I recall. And the feds had to okay the entrance of this gun in the United States, and it was a machine gun. Twirling it was another matter altogether, although it was perfectly balanced. It's like trying to twirl half of a baseball bat. I got to twirling it, and it worked. And so I just used my own West Texas expertise to sort of heighten that. It's an integral part of the old Robo personality, man, to twirl that gun into a holster like a cowboy. I've done some movies I'm not so proud of. I've done some movies that I'm proud of parts of. And I've done maybe 5 or 6 movies that I'm really proud of, and RoboCop is definitely one of them.
Okay. So, Mr. Morton, is this a man or is it a machine?
Well, he's technically an integrated cyborg. I'd be reluctant to categorize him as either, to tell you the truth.
And what about his intelligence? What is his intelligence quotient?
That's a funny question. I mean, his memory is computer-assisted. Now, we don't refer to computers as particularly intelligent. Fast, effective, yes, but intelligent per se, no, I wouldn't think so.
Will there be more RoboCops in the future?
Oh, yes, well, absolutely. The program is very cost-effective, and we feel after this initial project, there'll be a robo on every corner.
What's he doing when he's not fighting?
When he's not fighting, there's a specially designed chair that he sits in when he's at rest. He plays a mean jazz trumpet, studying kendo, chases female cyborgs, things like that. He's quite a guy.
Well, what about his personality? Is he a nice guy?
Is he on this floor? No, he's great. He's terrific. Fun at parties. Hell of a guy, really. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, he's a really nice guy. Yeah.
Anything else? No?
Okay, let's do it again.
That's a cat.
Yeah, we did close, yeah.
Detroit got its police force back today. In a surprising turn of events, OCP agreed to key demands made by striking police. In a night of widespread lawlessness, there were also moments of heroism. Justin Ballard-Watkins has that story.
Officer Ann Lewis, even while on strike, she risked her life to uphold the law. Broken bones, shot 3 times. What a girl. What a cop. Excuse me, Your Honor. Ann, ever consider another line of work?
No, I like being a cop. You know what they say. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen.
I don't know about you, but I'll sleep a little better tonight.
You bet. Next time you see a cop, smile. Thanks for watching.
Crisis is God's way of searching for the truth. And if we seek with him, we can discover our own humanity. Crisis can be a good thing. It brings people together.
I was going to go through the extraordinary background of everyone up here and their history and some of the films, the amazing films they've made in the past, but I'm not going to do that because I think we should get on with a discussion up here first a little bit, and then we open it up. And I'd like to start discussion with Paul Verhoeven, an amazing feat. I've seen all of your movies before this and then after this as well. What brought you to this strange, unusual combination of satire and violence and social commentary and what have you? I want to talk a little bit about the origins and what brought you to the film.
Well, my wife. Because I thought the script was terrible. Listen, I was living in Europe, you know. That's a different situation. So this for me was like
difficult to understand, let's put it that way. And so I put it aside after 20 pages or something, and then Martine picked it up. We were at the beach at the Côte d'Azur in France, and then I was going for a swim, and I came back, and then she said, you should really read this again. And then you should pay more attention to what you can do with that, and what's there on the page that you haven't seen. And then the second person that has to be acknowledged was Barbara Boyle, because she was at that time at Orion, and she was the one that ultimately convinced me to come over and check it out.
And when you came over, you had to put together a team that could capture this very unique feel, this sensibility that's in between a lot of things.
A lot of that was coincidence, I think.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know anybody here, so it was very difficult for me to choose anybody or in the crew or in the cast. And I was enormously helped by John Davison and at Neumeier, who was always with the production, to tell me exactly what is normal in the United States.
Whatever it was, you didn't do that. Okay. And Michael, I have a question. In your discussions with Paul, there's a lot of politics in this film. I know from our past, having worked this room in the past with both of you guys, that you had a left critical perspective, yet this is a movie that's come out and has been often criticized from the left in various ways, and a lot of people on the right have adopted. What'd you talk about with Paul about the politics of the film, and what do you think about it right now, both of you?
Well, I didn't know anything about the politics, so I just followed what was in the script, really. I had no idea, really, sometimes what it was about, really.
Well, I do think that Ed and I were both aware that even then corporations were being treated like people, unfortunately. And Ed actually had a job prior to the writing of it at the Black Tower at Universal, and so his sense of what a boardroom was really, I think he had fantasies about killing all those people. But personally, I protested the Vietnam War, and I feel that, you know, American capitalism is pretty much an out-of-control thing, and we sort of brought that to the script, you know, in an unbridled fashion.
Ed?
You're leaving me with that? Well, you know, we were always interested in political ideas for this, and I think that everybody's been pretty modest, because we talked a lot about this stuff, and a lot of the stuff we didn't have to talk about because we just sort of felt that way. And I think that one of the things I like about this is my friends on the left like it, or sometimes they don't, but my friends on the right like it too. And I think, as they say, good business is where you find it. Male fantasy, action fantasy is equal opportunity. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, that's the politics of it. I mean, it is about, you know, the future. I do think that people have equal claims on the future, regardless of political strife. And I think that's why this movie is interesting to people, because there's still issues here that we're talking about as the digital age comes upon us and machines come upon us. And so that's probably why it's still new, you know.
On the violence issue, that was one of the things that people keep bringing up, and, you know, what, do you have something you want to say about that? Any of you?
I've said many times I like violence.
I think I was very lucky in meeting Paul, because we both have an aesthetic for violence. I'm not sure why. My mother is here, and so don't make her feel bad.
You know, I could say something about the violence. I think because Paul lived in Europe, and the sensibility of European directors and African-American directors here is different from people like Tarantino. The violence has consequences. It's not just some kind of fantasy escapade. And I thought Paul brought that to the project.
Thank you.
Bill Tippett, you really are a legend. And
if you live long enough, right?
I didn't know what to call you, whether it's an animator or a special effects supervisor, but what you are is very clearly a storyteller. And for this film the costume, the modern costume, the whole mechanisms that were created are characters in their own right and so integral. You want to talk a little bit about the conception of the as it were, effects and the animation?
Well, yeah, I didn't do all the effects. I mean, Pete Coran did a lot of the RoboVision stuff, and Rocco Joffrey did all the matte paintings, great matte paintings. So I primarily handled the Ed 209 sequences on the show. And, you know, those were all done with conventional stop motion animation. And, you know, it was all, you know, I wouldn't characterize myself as whatever it is you said, but, you know, it's in the context that I usually work, and I've enjoyed working with Paul, I kind of see myself more as like a choreographer working with the director and working out how the kinesthetic beats of things and the ideas for what these, you know, characters are. And once we're on the same page, then it's pretty easy to do. And Paul and I always felt, you know, we kind of spoke the same language, and I like violence. So, you know, at a certain point when you're on the same wavelength, there's a telepathic thing that's happening, you know.
Yeah, I mean, on a very astoundingly low-budget movie, at least from what
it was ridiculous.
Yeah, what I've read, the RoboCop uniform was pretty expensive and pretty crucial and pretty central. You want to talk a little bit about conceiving it?
Well, it was, let me just start here, and someone else should jump in, but it was the essential gag of the picture, I think. I mean, everything else had to work, but if Peter and the costume didn't work, I don't think we would have had a movie. Rob Bottin is not here tonight. Rob Bottin is the genius who designed the suit.
One of the things that I thought Paul did very well was in introducing RoboCop. The first time you see him is on a monitor, then you see him behind frosted glass, then you see him through a fence, and with a very difficult third act face, you first see it in a reflection of a distorted piece of metal. So Paul is not putting it right in your face, he's building an illusion. Yeah. And I thought that was a tremendous thing that was brought to the project.
Well, that came from Rob Bottin too.
Yeah?
Yeah, he told me when I was working on the costume, he said, if you are going to show RoboCop suddenly like that coming out of a room or whatever, you know, and you see him frontal and really without any protection, then I think we will have a problem. And he said to me, you should introduce him step by step. You should introduce a part of him so that the audience gets accustomed to what they're going to see and that they will not be laughing. And so that was the reason that it was done that way, but I have to really acknowledge that the idea came from Rob Bottin. All right.
Peter Weller, you had to wear it. You had to be inside it. You also had another challenge.
Yeah, thank God I don't have to now.
Well, you know, you had a challenge because your role involved being very human and very mechanical, that you had to be convincing on both accounts. Do you want to talk a little bit about approaching that role? What did you do to prepare?
Well, first I got to also, like with Paul, acknowledge and Mike, the gifted applicator of that makeup, Stéphane Dupuis. I don't know if you know Stéphane Dupuis, but you know he's just. And that third act head, you know, the seams of that prosthetic are on camera. And it's rarely ever been done like that. Usually the seams of prosthetics on the face are tucked behind the ears. And that makeup face, that third act face, was a 6.5 hour just for that face. And Stefan and me and Rob's people would be going to work while the crew would be coming in from drinking. And it was 6.5 hours to do that face, then it was another hour and a half to put on the suit. So we'd worked at essentially an 8.5 hour day before Paul started burning film. And I think you would only shoot 5 hours on that face or something like that before it was done, something.
Yeah, we were shooting, of course, 13, 14 hours, I think, but
that face was
that face was well, it took forever to get you into that.
Yeah.
Especially when it was the latter part of it. Interesting enough, if you look at that, what Rob Bottin did, the trick is, of course, that the lower part of the head the back part of the head is lower than the front part. So it looks like something is missing there, something. And of course, what he did is make the forehead longer. So you think this is the skin, this is real, but this is already not real here. It's upper part, so that you can immediately, so that the real head goes then according to the skull, but the upper part, the frontal part, is about this higher. And that was, let's say, a really wonderful trick, so that you would be really deceived.
Yeah, it was, and all those guys, you know, what makes it, you know, a gifted movie is all those accidents like Paul was talking about. But to talk about the movement of the deal, initially Moni Akin and I had developed a very sort of liquid, serpentine sort of movement, and then whatever the, you know, the Chinese word for crisis is the same for opportunity, and when we were trying to fit that particular movement, which I'd worked on for 6 months, into the suit, it wasn't going to work. So we spent a weekend redesigning and tearing out parts of the inner suit. So then Rob and Paul were shooting tests, and we had already been into the thick of the film at the time. And you know, Moni took me aside and said, the constrictions of this suit will work for us. What you have to do is take the articulation or the staccato at the end of a movement and really make it pronounced and actually accentuate what he was saying in the beginning of it. Really, really push out the chest. And I felt while I was doing these tests with Paul, I felt it was really phony and operatic and, you know, and corny. And that afternoon, Moni rented from me. He says, I want you to look at a guy who's a dancer, who's a mime, he was a singer, he's one of the great silent film stars ever. Nikolai Cherkasov was in Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible. And I went back to the hotel and started watching this with Moni, and you know, it's essentially, although it's stylized, it's a fairly naturalistically shot film, but you see Cherkasov at the beginning of it, you know, he looks like Dracula. He turns into the camera with this massive sort of operatic stare, and everything he does is heightened, and it looks crazy for about 5 minutes, but 20 minutes into it, you completely are riveted by how gargantuan-like these articulations of his body are. So I watched that all week. I watched that while I was shooting the first week of the suit with Paul, and that's essentially what I started to work on. And I just want to say that when I'm watching this film sometimes in the past, I haven't watched it in about 10 years, I watched it in Dallas about a month ago with Paul, with Ed and Michael in Dallas with the Dallas crew. And it was the first time I really got out of my own way and looking at, well, I didn't have that movement down right, I didn't have this, all that, okay, that's when I was really cooking, and that's when Paul and I were really like moving the thing along. I really got out of the way myself and watched the film as a film, like you said. I just have to say this, the thing I think that makes this film non-ephemeral and maybe anthropological, maybe you can watch it in 200 years and see what the 20th century, you know, technology was about, and privatization, and social history, and what would have happened if apartheid. You know, the whole film starts with the thing about apartheid. It turns out what would have happened had not there been some sort of peace thing. It's loaded with social history, this film. And when I got out of the way from Dallas, Sherry and I were watching it in Dallas, and said, you know, I just have to say I'm just extraordinarily proud to be part of a film as gifted as this, where, as like Phil said, all of the accidents, the wonderful accidents that happen in conjunction with the extraordinary gifts of talent that were concerned with it. And on that note, I gotta say, Paul McCrane sitting in the back, there's Miguel Ferrer, there's Felton over here, you know, Kurtwood is here, you know. It's a phenomenal cast, and Paul got to say one of my 2 favorite lines. It's also a favorite line of a lot of people. I like it. I like it. There you go, Paul.
Hey, Nancy, you're the only girl in this movie in a weird way. I mean, you know, it's a real masculine thing, and
Well, there is Mrs. Murphy.
Well, that's true. You're the only girl with a gun. What is it like to be the girl in the action movie? I mean, what does that mean for you at all? Do you get women coming up to you and asking you about that?
No, not really. I I just want to say, unlike Paul, I thought it was a great script.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, that for me
He thought it was okay, too.
I mean, wanting to work with Paul, I had seen Soldier of Orange, which I loved. And I read this script, and the first thing I thought was, well, RoboCop, they'll change that. That's a terrible title. But I sat down to read a few pages of it and just whipped through the script. And in that moment, I thought, I have to be in this movie. I think that the letters I've gotten have been probably more from men than from women about the role, oddly enough, but because they love this movie so much. And I'm very proud to be part of it. And I also want to say about Peter, it took, you can't even imagine how much discipline to do what he did, to even, I mean, he was put together with a little screwdriver every day. It took hours and hours and hours. And I just think he was masterful in the role, really.
Thank you for your cooperation.
You play a role. You play a role of a very strong-willed woman who knows what she wants and knows how to get it, and it's a cop. Now that broke new ground. It broke new ground, I think, in terms of the characterization, but also the depiction of a woman playing those roles. How did you get ready to do that? How did you do it so convincingly? Talk a little bit about your background and prep.
Thank you for the convincing part. It was, you know, I was raised in New York. My father was a cop, so I thought I had some understanding of that. I had the wonderful Randy Moore training me with guns, and I think I went out. I remember going out to the police academy at some point, but
Wave your hand, Randy. There he is.
he handled all the guns on the movie. You know, really, I just looked at it in terms of the partnership. That, for me, was the most significant piece for me to look at in the movie.
It's interesting that when I read the script after my disappointment in the beginning, of course, but I got over that and realized that it was really a fantastic script, in fact, and very innovative. And I think we did it in an innovative way, but it was already all on the page, clearly. The strange thing is that when I read, which was the second draft, and I just came from Europe, so I immediately thought RoboCop, or Murphy in this case, in the beginning, should have an affair with Nancy. And I think the producers and Ed and Michael wrote that draft for me, which was the third draft, because that I thought was absolutely necessary. Should be some, what the French like, yeah, and me too, clearly. But so then I got that script, the third draft, and I started reading. And then for the first time, I realized that I was in the United States and that it was just wrong. And that this whole affair was just a stupid European idea, and it should be taken out immediately. And I asked the writers to go back to the second draft and let's shoot that. It's very strange.
This is a true story, and this is so unusual, I have to say, as an American screenwriter. Imagine if it had been an American director. He would have said, "Oh, you fucked it up, you're fired." And he didn't. He said, "Oh, I think I get the second draft. Let's go back to that."
Yeah,
and then from that moment on, it was all full. I mean, he did that draft.
Well, for Paul to say I was wrong, let's put.
He didn't say he was wrong.
Well, for him to say.
Well, let me say it now. I was completely wrong. And it's interesting because then I also realized that what had to be avoided was that there would be in the thinking of the audience, in the perception of the audience, a feeling that there should be something between RoboCop or Murphy and Lewis. Because, of course, as we look at the costume, there is not much chance to do any stuff there. And so I asked Nancy, which was probably not so nice, but it had to be done, to cut her hair and make herself as boy-like as possible.
because I wanted to avoid any sexual thinking between Murphy, RoboCop, and Lewis. And then I asked her to eat a lot. You might have forgotten
no, I
that.
quit smoking.
I don't even remember that.
Oh, yes, I remember that I gained a lot of weight. Yes, I do. Well, you know, I didn't mind getting my hair cut, but 8 times by 4 different people and the worst haircut in the world, that was not so fabulous. But I thought it was also essential, too, to be I mean, obviously, this would have been silly. So it worked. It worked really well.
Why don't we open this up a little bit?
Great, it's very great. Thank you.
Repeat the question back. So
Yeah, why I didn't want to direct the sequel. Well, there were several reasons. I think, first of all, of course, the original writers were not there anymore. That was the main reason, I think. Although they had worked a little bit at the beginning of the second episode, but ultimately somebody else was brought in, and that made it. I felt very uncomfortable there. And then on top of that, I hate to do sequels. Really. In fact, I have been fortunate to be able to refuse them all. And it came close, certainly with Basic Instinct too. But I'm so glad I didn't do it, you know.
Right over here, and then we'll move around the room. But shout it out.
The ending of this movie is extraordinarily satisfying, and I'm wondering if
Well, you know, it actually, we actually had there was an ending we cut off the movie. There was a little more of a movie. All the media breaks were wrapped up, and we showed that at one screening. And Mike Medavoy, who's not here, told us to cut it out because there were breasts in it. He said the tits are out, and they were. But no, the movie that was pretty much the script as it was. I think it went to the natural ending. It was hard to get to that. John Davison came up with the last line, "You're fired." One day in a meeting, and I thought, wow, that's a really smart idea. We put it in, and I don't know, Mike and I, and then Paul and I, worried it forever until we couldn't anymore.
The fourth directive is interesting because it really is the kryptonite, and because it's laid in there and everyone's watching it over 2 or 3 tracks through the whole film. I didn't think it was going to work. I was wrong. Said nobody's going to get that, but everybody got it. So thank God for that.
Right back here.
One thing that is most indelible about it to me, even when the concept of sound editing is brought up and sound design, is this film. You just feel it in your gut. Every movement of RoboCop, every industrial hum in the background. I'm just wondering how much of that was apart from the beginning, from the script, from...
It was all in the script. Oh, come on. That was Steve Flick. Steve Flick won an Academy Award and should have, I believe, for this movie.
And the music was not in the script.
Do you think that there is room in the modern American lexicon for more action blockbusters that are quite as critical of our current society as this film was at its time?
I'd like to jump right into that. Someone a little smarter than me pointed out that most of the superhero films after 9/11 endorsed the Bush Doctrine, which is essentially a first strike or a preemptive strike. And this narrative is different. It's a Western in which the law enforcer turns on the company that fabricated it. So maybe we've closed a door on that kind of storytelling. I don't know. I thought the Avengers was like a Nickelodeon cartoon compared to this, but, you know.
This question is for the writers. If Orion had decided to go with you guys for the sequel, was there any specific area you wanted to explore with RoboCop, or where you'd want to take him?
Ed had the greatest idea for the sequel that he told me, or it was. I think was it you were telling me that they wanted maybe to be a black RoboCop at one point, and Ed had the great idea to call it RoboCop, and he's not working on it anymore.
Do you want to? Well, we were force majeured off of the sequel because of the writer's strike. At Act of God, force majeure Latin which meant that
Yes, that's Latin.
we were replaced by someone who actually Ed brought into the original Robo family, Frank Miller. So you have
Said that.
You want to say any more about that, Ed? About that?
Frank Miller?
We actually wrote a first draft of RoboCop 2 before the strike happened, and essentially he's in this fight with some bad guys, and somebody pulls out an RPG and hits him in the chest with it, and we have a title card 25 years later, and we go down into a sub-basement, and we find him in suspended animation like Han Solo at the end of the second Star Wars film. And we didn't get much further than that.
We were working for Oliver Stone, and I think the villain became Oliver Stone.
There were sex bots. Well, one of our jokes was come down to the Derrick and pump some sex bots. The Derrick was a bar in Old Detroit. So we tried to keep the tradition going.
I had read that there was a possibility of making Lewis, a cyborg as well, and I was wondering, Nancy, were you looking forward to that opportunity to?
Not even a little bit, no. I could never do what he did.
Actually, there was a funny story about that because I ran into Nancy when we were writing this stupid idea about 25 years ahead, and I said, hey, we're going to put you in the movie and we're going to age you. And she said, I'm not going to be in that movie.
On this side, back there.
My question is, who came up with the idea of establishing the world by showing commercials in the news? Because I think the way it sets up the tone of the world and society, and it's brilliant.
That was in the script. That was something Mike and I did.
And Paul didn't like.
And Paul didn't cut it out.
Thank you, guys.
We actually had a lot of fun with the media breaks. It was sort of an unalloyed political commentary. It was some of the most fun writing time we had.
Yeah, I think the idea of being able to cut to it, before that, there had always been, you would cut to the studio, and then you would usually have a camera, somebody would shoot the back of a camera, and then you would go into the scene that way. But Paul just said, we'll just cut right into it. And I guess it's called Brechtian, I learned later.
Strangely enough, that was based on the painter Mondrian. I was thinking about these black lines that he has in his later abstract paintings between the blue and the red squares, and there are black lines like this. And I thought that the movie should be that way. So there would be scenes, and then boom, something else, and then back to the scenes. So when I read that, which was already presented in the script, I immediately thought we should not be trying to integrate this kind of it's playing in when the officers go to work or whatever, putting it into the scene, and just forget about that and just say bomb. And I think that still was very audacious of the writers to present it that way, And I'm glad I followed their cue and did it that way.
Actually, Paul came up with the heart commercial. So the heart commercial, we care, Mr. Verhoeven.
Yeah, but the question of trivializing the media, trivializing the news, taking serious events and putting a spin on them that's entertaining, that's a very contemporary theme. At the time when you did this, I think you were kind of way out there.
Well, actually, if you look, I didn't know this until after the movie because I watched Soldier of Orange after I saw this movie. But if you look at the newsreel footage in Soldier of Orange, Paul's already well aware of playing around with media. So we were lucky to get him. And yeah, we had independently come up with this idea of, I would say it's probably we're the Saturday Night Live generation. So, we stole it from them a little bit just as a way to go in. And what I find interesting about it is it's a lovely way to put a lot of exposition in fast. And that's what I like about it.
And also, the media breaks fall at act breaks, roughly 30 or 35-minute intervals, too. So they're sort of like closing of one curtain and opening of another. And the rise of action with RoboCop out on the street, that ends with the mayor hostage, and then he beautifully transitions into a media break. End of Act 1. On and on it goes.
I'm just wondering about this, because I've always complained this, because I've never noticed a character like RoboCop that's like half human, half cyborg, and is like the hero of like an action film. I've never seen that before RoboCop. So question for the writers is, like, how did you exactly come up with that? Like, some kind of weird inspiration involving a car accident or some sort of weird, I don't know, like just out of curiosity, how did you create this weird toaster man character? So, yeah.
You know, there were some, you know, it's a process of addition, obviously, and I knew very little about the movement exercises that Peter went through. I mean, I watched him do it, and I was amazed, and I thought he, you know, was a good mime when he was in college or something. But, you know, one of the things, we had rules for RoboCop, the sort of John Wayne rules. He can't kiss the girl, he can't be seen on a telephone, and he can't fly. And they did all three of those things in number 3. When we weren't around. So we also talked a lot about the Man in the Iron Mask and Frankenstein and those eternal themes.
I had, I mean, my idea came, I was actually working on another movie in the art department. I wasn't officially working on the movie, but it was shooting near my office. It was Blade Runner. And I watched that movie for 4 nights, and then someone told me it was about a robot. And they pointed at Sean Young, who was wearing a tutu, and they said, "That's the robot." And I said, "No, that's not the robot." And so I had an image of this robot trying to figure out, this robot cop trying to figure out human behavior. And it may have been based a little bit on my experiences that night on the big Blade Runner street. But then later I thought about it would be interesting if the person wasn't a robot, but was a human being who was coping with being a machine. That was the future, that we weren't going to avoid it, that we were it. And that was kind of where it came from me.
All movies are in some way a dialogue. We learn from past masters of the craft. Are there any other films you'd want to talk about that you had in the anyone here, and Paul particularly, that you had in the back of your mind as you were conceiving of this quite original work?
Yeah, my movie about Jesus, yeah.
Okay.
I was a big Dirty Harry fan.
Listen, I'd like to add something about what Paul just said about Jesus. You know, there's a theme in this. I venture to say the thing that makes it non-ephemeral and long-lasting, and why people go back to it is, you know, aside from the brilliance of the writing and the comedy and the good guys and the bad guys and the win and the loss, there's like all great stories, particularly in Western literature, there's a theme that, you know, this is kudos to Paul, because I don't know if American would have gotten it, but there are images, and there's constant images of resurrection. And if the movie itself isn't about resurrection, where a guy ends up saying Murphy, if that's not blatant enough, then, you know, there are, and it's not just, you know, gospel resurrection, but, you know, resurrection is a topos that comes from Egypt, it's Persian, it's Pharisaic, Jewish, and it comes from the golem, Frankenstein, whatever. But the great films always, and the great stories always, are someone who's taken back from death and been reborn. And Paul has, you know, there is infused it with images from it, you know, and they're subtle. But I just have to hearken back to a sort of a nice argument that Paul and I had in my hotel room when we were reading through the script. Right before I was starting, we'd read through the script and I'd ask him questions. And it seemed to me, and it seemed to a couple of people, that, bear with me here, and it's an American thing, and I direct a lot of television now. And the television Hollywood way is to go about this. Follow me. This is the revision of RoboCop. That RoboCop is RoboCop, and then Nancy Allen comes along and sees him twirling the gun and goes, "Murphy, it's you." And then he goes out and arrests Paul McCrane. Paul McCrane hears him say the words that remind him of when he was busted, right? This is the evidence of physical, this is the evidence in a physical world. And then RoboCop would go back and start to have dreams, you see? And this is the Western way of looking at it. That physical evidence motivates then us going home and having dreams and self-realization. So I was asking Paul, I said, why is he having these dreams? And you might remember this conversation, but it was absolutely transforming to me. I said, why is he having these dreams first? Why isn't he like, which is what I'm used to seeing in the Hollywood film, going out and having a physical experience and then coming back and having some sort of mental deal or, you know, soulful deal. And then Paul said to me, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, no, you got got this backwards because the one thing that they have not taken away from him, and I'm paraphrasing this context, is his soul. And the soul is waking up on its own. And you could fill in the blanks there because it's God-given, you know, because it's given by the cosmos, because that's the thing that technology, progress, privatization, and all the things that have taken these things away from him cannot take. And that's what's waking up, and then the soul wakes up, and then it's born out again in a physical world. You get that? Okay. That's the miracle of this film, man. And I'm telling you, I'm in a meeting today in a TV series, which is great, so forth, and they want that. They want, you know, the physical life to happen first, and then the girl goes home and she has a couple of dreams, and then she realizes the epiphany. You know what I'm saying? And that's the way it's done in Hollywood, and it's not the way it's done in this movie, man. And I mentioned to say, the magic of this movie are these images. The magic underneath it all are these images of resurrection and subsequently the life of the soul that transcends all this other mishigas that RoboCop goes through. I think that's what makes the movie non-ephemeral. I think eventually when they say Murphy and everybody goes, wow, that's what everybody's getting out of it, is resurrection.
Yeah, from creative, artistic, or whatever you want to call it, I can talk about the soul clearly because we can, in a movie, we can believe in the soul. Unfortunately, I don't think it exists.
So
drive home carefully.
You sure had me in that hotel room, man.
Let me say, a lot of people talk about this is a cult movie. I think that's wrong phrase. It's a movie that's
it's a universal movie, man.
Yeah, a movie about stuff.
Yeah.
That matters,
Yeah.
and it's done with an artistry that realizes that full potential at every point, and that there's an enduring interest and will continue to have an enduring interest. I'm absolutely convinced. So I'm very honored to be here among you guys.
Ed said at the end of the process, "Boy, this is one we made when no one was looking." And I went, "What was he talking about?" But clearly, even at that time, the studios would squeeze the life out of things, and so the sort of bottom-up organizational principle. There were 8 pieces of good luck that happened that sort of lined up, and you can't legislate that.
Any last words here, Paul? You should have the last word.
Yeah. I will use it to thank Peter Weller for what he had to go through and what he achieved, and for a very important creative cooperation. I mean, we had our conflicts, we solved them, and we went on, and he had very hard times, clearly, with that costume, terrible costume to work in. You know, you couldn't really walk, everything was terrible. And he had to go through that, but that is not the point. The point is that what Peter did is, in the framework of the film, I believe in the soul too. I mean, for me, the movie was, I wanted to make the movie right at the moment that I read the scene that he goes back to his house and gets his dreams about, or memories, isn't it? That was the moment that when I got to that point, that I thought, I want to make this movie. This is beautiful from an artistic point of view. You know, there's a difference between me as an artist and me as let's say, a thinking being. And what Peter did is bring that soul that is so important to the movie to the screen. And he did that in the most, let's say, normal way, without pushing ever, always keeping, let's say, a very cool approach to that, which I love in any art, that it is not on your nose, but it is really a little bit at a certain distance. And Peter did that in the most beautiful way. And I love you very much, Peter.
I love you, Paul.
You know, and just before we go, it's not a quid pro quo, but like I say, you know, I just finished directing a television series and another one, so forth, and I rip off his stuff all the time. I ripped off his stuff yesterday. If you notice, I don't know, you guys are film students out here. He's a master at hinging people into another action, pulling people out of cars, hinging them one way, going the other. There's a consistency and an action to his movies that I've stolen from him from the day I met him. And also, this is another thing I steal from him. I hear this in my mind, and Nancy remembers this too. Why aren't we shooting? Remember this? Why aren't we shooting? And you know, I say that daily, man. You know, as this guy, he hit the ground in 7th gear every day. I mean, he's already in 7th gear. And Nancy and I go, God, doesn't he warm up? I mean, isn't there like, you know, isn't there sort of like, you know, go to the set, kind of rehearse, have some coffee? No, not with Paul, man. 7 o'clock in the morning, you are going 180 miles an hour until the wrap, man. And I've gleaned that from him, stolen it from him, referred him to everybody in the world, and I'm as grateful to you as you are to me, man. So I love you.
You know, people talk about the fact that really, really great movies are written 4 times. They're written in the initial script, they're rewritten in the production, they're rewritten in the editing, and finally they're rewritten by the audience, who bring their own experience and values. The fact that we have an audience here, both the creative people involved in this project, but also a lot of other people, including young people who have seen this film multiple times, suggests it will keep being rewritten again and again into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Phil Tippett. I was the visual effects supervisor for the Ed 209 scenes on RoboCop. Primarily responsible for the stop motion animation on the Ed 209, the police droid sequences. Yeah, for the stop motion characters, the deal is really no different than the currently computer graphic characters today. It's finding what's in the script that's compelling or interesting, what the background of the character is, and it really depends on what it is. I know for Ed 209, we taped and filmed a lot of, actually at that time I think it was the 16mm film, robots. We shot a lot of robotic elements and went to like mills and lathes and looked at the attack and decay of movement and how things jiggled. And you begin to build up these files. And then you work very closely with the director in laying out the choreography in storyboard form. And that pretty much determines the approach that you use for actually shooting on the set and making sure that the plan that you have started out with is the plan you execute on the day, or that it doesn't vary more than 10 or 15%, because particularly for the stop motion photography and the budgets that we were working with then really didn't allow for any really elaborate camera moves where you have to track the thing in. They were pretty much all locked off shots, and so all the choreography of the surrounding action can't be too wild and handheld and then cut to this boring locked off shot. Paul, one of the things that characterizes his picture making style is his camera choreography, and then it comes to these shots where, what, you want me to lock off the camera for all the shots? Yeah. I'll go, okay. Because of the budgetary constraints that we had, he was very reasonable at collaborating and allowing the structure of the scenes to be determined by the limitations of the technology. And at the time, stop motion animation was kind of a tricky thing. There were certain kinds of things you did with it and certain kinds of things you didn't do with it. And the plan, as we had developed it, was to structure the scenes around a large-scale prop that just stood there for the dialogue scenes and a stop-motion model for the action and ambulatory scenes. And just making sure that there was kind of an internal logic, because the thing was a robot, it could shut itself down, it would walk into a room, pa-dunk, jink, dunk, power itself down, and then we'd wheel in the big prop. Most of the time we used the full-scale prop that Craig Hayes built. and shoot the dialogue scenes. And Paul did the rehearsal, so Paul would, come in and be Ed 209 and do his, bah, 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 yeah, and frighten all the actors, and that was like the run-through, and we'd film that run-through. And then, Paul would leave, and we'd film a burst of the Ed 209, that would be our lighting reference, and we'd pull that out. And the actors had all their eye lines, and, and Paul, directed them. You look here, and then you look there, and he was very careful about his, his choreography and his layouts. And that was pretty much the structure of how we dealt with all that stuff, and it allowed, created a very simple but convincing illusion. That's all very important. Then, then primarily what you're dealing with is the presence of the thing inside the locked off frame, and it doesn't become about, all the camera choreography. It becomes about the action of the thing. There really wasn't a lot of money to work with, so we couldn't get into really any fancy blue screen photography, and at that time it was certainly quite pre-digital technology. So the only way at that time of creating these artificial characters was either putting a guy in a suit or building a big prop or doing a stop motion animation puppet. So I was a big proponent of unearthing a lot of the Ray Harryhausen techniques. Having worked for a number of years at Lucasfilm, most of the work and the compositing that was done there was via blue screen, and it's a very kind of a strange, impersonal way of working, where you have to imagine what you're shooting against a nondescript blue screen. But with rear screen photography, which is what we used on RoboCop, it was a development of the de-animation process that Ray Harryhausen used from Sinbad on, which you shoot a photographic background plate, project it onto a translucent screen, build a stage, put your puppet in front of that, stop motion puppet in front of that, light that puppet so that it matches the background, and have any foreground objects that you need to, and shoot that. Now there's a whole litany of different tricks that you can apply to create masks that break up the actual photographic background that you've shot, that allows you to place the character within the photographic background. And that means shooting through panes of glass that you've painted out black, or doing paintings on glass that you've lit to match. And all of the RoboCop photography was done with VistaVision background plates, a large 8x format that we were very careful in designing, as all reproduction, photographic reproduction, gains contrast and grain and color distortion. So we shot on the widest format, double the size of the 4x taking cameras. That allowed us the smallest amount of grain, and we worked at creating very special low contrast masks for the backgrounds as well, because we knew that the backgrounds were going to gain. So I was very lucky to have, working for me at that time, Harry Walton, who was very adept at developing these contrast masking plates.